Good evening, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. We're continuing our examination of the Textual Confidence Collective. So this is part 7, and so this is entitled Examining the Textual Confidence Collective, part 7 by Nick Sayers. And so what we're doing is we are examining what Mark Ward and Timothy Berg are saying about Westcott and Hort, the critical text, the Textus Receptus, and a lot of other things. And so what they've done in this Textual Confidence Collective, they've gotten Maurice Robinson, and they've asked him to talk about King James onlyism and the Textus Receptus and things like that. Now, where would you put Maurice Robinson as a scholar? Well, a lot of people who are in the King James only movement or TR only, whatever you get labeled or whatever you label yourself, a lot of people know, say, someone like James Snap Jr. Now, James Snap Jr., sometimes he's a friend of the Textus Receptus position, and sometimes he's an enemy. Maurice Robinson is the same. Sometimes he's defending things like the Pericope Adulterae, the 12 verses that the critical text guys want to delete. And so we look at that and we say, yeah, kudos to you. You want to defend that. But there are many other places where he comes against the Textus Receptus, where he believes that the Textus Receptus is an inferior text. And so what people have to realize is several key things that the Textual Confidence Collective are trying to do. And so what they're doing is they're playing on some of the ignorance that King James TR people have surrounding the text. And so with this video, I'm going to show you some keys so that when they bring up these straw man arguments, we can confront them head on. And we can also defend our position. Because what's happened over the years, there have been certain people who have adopted terms like majority text. They've followed Dean John William Burgon. They've followed Scrivener. They've followed Hoskia. They've followed a bunch of these guys. And at the end of the day, what it's done, it can cause confusion, because then all these guys have to do is point out, or Hoskia believed this, or Burgon didn't defend the TR here, or Scrivener, he was pretty much like the Westcott and Hort guy. There's not much difference between them. And so what that does then is people can have these arguments that have no real substance. And so they're easily debunked. And so what that can cause people to do is feel that their position is being attacked, when the reality is, if you just knew that Dean John William Burgon is pretty much a majority text guy, the father of the majority text movement, basically, the modern day majority text movement, if you understand, people like Hoskia, Miller were basically just in that same type of range, then it's not a real big deal. And someone like Scrivener, if you just go, well, he's pretty much a Westcott and Hort guy, but he printed a TR that's like 99.999999999% Beza's work. So basically sort of, I don't want to accuse him of plagiarism, but he basically plagiarized the work of Beza and just put it, like I said in my last video, a tiny little sprinkling of salt on it and said, it's the Scrivener's text. So then what people do, all they have to do is discredit Scrivener and say, look, he's not a TR defender. And people get very confused about this. So there is a lot of strange teaching. There's a lot of strange concepts around the majority text, around the Byzantine text movement. So we're going to focus in on that tonight. And I believe that if you watch through this video, it'll help you. It'll teach you exactly where you need to stand, because what the majority text movement is basically critical text light. It's just basically just a It's a Pepsi, but without sugar sort of thing. It's the same sort of deal. They're trying to reconstruct a text. See, we believe we already have a text. We're not trying to reconstruct a text. We're defending a text that's already been used. Where these guys they still don't have their text. So they're still trying to piece it together. And what they're doing is they're using extant manuscripts. So I'm going to look at a lot of these terms. So extant means what you have in your hand right now. So it doesn't matter if you've got reams and reams and reams of history showing that the Greek text was translated into Latin, say, for example, but those Greek readings might have been lost. Oh, well, that doesn't matter because it's not available today, sort of thing. So unless you've got it in your hands today, you can't use it. And so what we see with these two camps is they're both deeply influenced by the same philosophies. And unfortunately, this comes out with what Maurice Robinson says. And as far as I understand, like I only ever use Maurice Robinson's material if someone talks about, say, the Pericope Adulterae or the last 12 verses of Mark. I might use James Snap's material. Doesn't mean I agree with them at all. I mean, if a critical text guy was defending, like, say, sometimes we see James White might say, the Father forgive them for they know not what they do. That should be thrown into the bin. But Dan Wallace says, no, it should be kept as a verse in Scripture. So these guys are at loggerheads. But if I listen to what Dan Wallace says and agree with it, it doesn't mean I agree with everything with Dan Wallace. See, these guys, what they try and do is say to Maurice Robinson, well, King James people are using your argumentation and sort of make out that we're trying to adopt him as a King James onlyist. I don't know anyone who's trying to do that. And it's sort of strange that these guys have the Textual Confidence Collective where they're talking about slanderous things that are said about Westcott and Hort, where at the end of the day, these guys say slanderous things about King James people. Now, if they're just looking at their YouTube comments, if I was to just go on Facebook comments or YouTube comments from critical text people who say, oh, the NIV is fine and all the rest of it, I could talk about flat earth. I could talk about all sorts of strange and bizarre things and just sort of say, well, some of these people are flat earthers. Some of these people believe these weird things. Some of these people believe that, King James was a pedophile. Some of these people believe this and believe that. But that doesn't mean that everyone believes that. So this is what I find with Mark Ward. He'll go with some comments that are in his YouTube feed, and he'll run with those things. Like, I was talking to a pastor the other day who said this one thing, and then that sort of blows out to like, well, everyone who is a TR defender, KJV defender, we all sort of fall into that same sort of category, which is it's a genetic fallacy. And so what he's doing is a fallacy, logical fallacy, genetic fallacy. We're not all related. We don't all have a cult leader who we look to for the answers. We just look at the data, and if the data makes sense to us, then we run with that data. And so sometimes Maurice Robinson, he says things that make sense. Sometimes he says things that don't make sense. And so even with King James defenders, TR defenders, some people say things that make sense. Some people say things that don't make sense. And so it doesn't mean I'm tied to any one of them. It doesn't mean I agree with everything Will Kinney says. A lot of what he says, I would just go in general agreement. Yeah, okay, yeah, he's got a good point there. But there are some things I'm like, I don't agree with that article much. Okay, I'll just move on. And then I'd look at the KJVtoday.net page, and I go, yeah, I agree with this. I agree with it. Then there might be just an article. I'm like, no, actually, that article, I don't agree with that at all. And so pretty much what we're doing, we're siding with truth. We're not siding with personality. We're not siding with denominationalism. Now, I know some people might be in a IFB or new IFB or whatever, and they're like, we're King James and that's it. And so it's because of a denominational movement. But at the end of the day, most Textus Receptus, King James people that I associate with and I know, they are doing it because they believe that these are the words of God. Okay, so this video goes for about 34 minutes, so I think that it might carry on into 2 videos. But what I'm going to do from the get-go, I just want to let you know that I'm going to be reading some of Gavin McGrath's material. So if I do break into some lengthy reading, this is only just because I have Gavin McGrath's material. Now, he's given me permission to put this material anywhere, as long as I give him credit for that. So that's what I'm doing now. And so Gavin McGrath is a fellow Australian. So he lives in the same state as I do. We've talked, I guess it's about 9 years ago when I first really talked to him, but I've known about his material for quite a long time. And he has some very, very good and interesting things to say about the Burgonites and this movement that came and was started by Dean John William Burgon. That he did not defend the Textus Receptus, but he actually defended the traditional text, which today is known as the majority text. And so I'm going to be talking about some of the misdefinitions concerning Textus Receptus, concerning the majority text. We're going to look at all this. But what I want to do is I want to respond as we're looking at this video. So I think we'll just start off with this video. We'll start from the beginning. And so let's get straight into this. If you have any comments along the way, feel free to just throw them up there in the live chat. And let's get started.
Textual very.
Whoops. I think I just put it there just for a bit better screenshot rather than Mark Ward at the beginning.
The Textual Confidence Collective has a bonus episode for you to round out our 2nd season. Tim Berg and I sat down at a hotel in San Antonio, Texas during the National Evangelical Theological Society meeting to talk to Byzantine majority text proponent Dr. Maurice Robinson about King James onlyism. Honestly, I wish...
So he called him a Byzantine majority text proponent. So that's what he would want to be called. I don't think Mark Ward would turn around and say you are this or you are that, like that they do with us. They call us, textual absolutists. It's like, Hail Hitler sort of thing. It's like we're on the wrong side of the fence, apparently, because we believe that God has preserved every word. And we believe that if you were to say to me, what does this psalm say? I could point you to every word and tell you exactly what it means. But they represent the majority text guys quite favorably and charitably, but usually when it comes to TR defenders, King James preferred people, we get labeled Ruckmanites and all this type of language. So let's just continue.
We could have recorded all of the before and after chatter that we had while we were setting up and taking down. Robinson's knowledge of the King James only movement is long and personal. His knowledge of New Testament textual criticism can be given the same adjectives. He is a remarkable man. Nerds who enjoy discussion of New Testament textual criticism will thrill to hear this conversation, I promise. I got to ask Dr. Robinson some questions that I've wanted to ask for a good while, and so did Tim. To be clear, this bonus episode isn't really part of the Textual Confidence Collective's 2nd season because we didn't talk about Westcott and Hort with Dr. Robinson, but you'll see why we just had to sit with him and why we just had to share this conversation with you. Maurice Robinson shows in this talk clearly that his name cannot be invoked justly by King James and TR defenders. And
so you notice that Mark Ward's saying this. His name can't be invoked by King James and TR defenders. This is ridiculous. I mean, like I said, I can invoke Dan Wallace. If Dan Wallace says something true, I can say, well, Dan Wallace said this. And half the time, the people on the critical text side are not listening to Textus Receptus scholarship. They just mock it and they laugh at it and they say, well, we're sort of like people who believe in evolution. If we were in the sciences, people, if we believed in young earth creationism, if we didn't believe in evolution, people would just mock us and just say, well, look at these young earth creationists. What can they offer to us? What sort of knowledge do they have? And so at the end of the day, we most of the time are quoting these scholars back at other scholars and saying, because these guys obviously respect Robinson, so why aren't they respecting his argumentation? And when it comes to, say, the Pericope Adulterae, every time Mark Ward brings that up from now on, I'll say, well, why don't you just read Robinson? Because, see, the thing is, Robinson, he sort of goes halfway, and they're not listening to us at all. They just think we have a King James bias. We just have a tradition. You know, James White will say this. We just have a tradition. We're stuck in the mud. Our wheels are spinning back in 1611. Yeah, we're stuck back in this traditional type of thing, where textual criticism has moved with the sciences, and we've got all these discoveries. And so what about the papyri, and what about archaeology? And we should be looking at all this sort of stuff. And so oftentimes they're using that type of argumentation against us. So if James White, for example, when it comes to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, where it says God was manifest in the flesh, so Dan Wallace would say he appeared in the body, or I'm pretty sure Mark Ward would say the same. These guys would say the word os, which means who, is the correct reading, where I would say theos is the correct reading. But James White agrees with me. In his book, if you read his book, he clearly says that the correct reading is what the Textus Receptus has. But then he goes on and sort of says, well, the other readings aren't a conspiracy theory or something like that. But it's quite amazing. And so oftentimes I'm not quoting James White because, I really love James White and, I just think his scholarship's amazing. Or I'm quoting it back at these guys and saying, why have you got this difference between James White? And sort of putting a bit of a stick in their spokes, in their bicycle, and making them stop and think about what they're doing and what they're saying, because they'll very proudly say that they don't follow the Pericope Adulterae, the last 12 verses of Mark, and so when I'm saying, okay, James Snap Jr. said this, or Maurice Robinson said this, I'm saying this as I'm naming these people because that is scholarship that they respect, or they say they respect. Where they don't respect my scholarship, Jeff Riddle's scholarship, they just mock it, and they half the time they don't even listen, or just to completely ignore everything. And then when it comes time to talk about those type of things, like these guys bring up Revelation 16:5, which I would basically say that I'm probably the world leading expert on that one verse, because I've written a book about it. I've basically covered everything to do with it. TurretinFan's just made 20 long videos against it, and I made 30 rebuttals against what he was saying. And I went through all that, and it only strengthened my position. I'm absolutely convinced that Revelation 16:5 is a correct reading as it appears in the King James and the Textus Receptus. And so, but at the end of the day, these guys won't listen to my scholarship. They will overlook that and just look at the kooky, the Ruckmanites, the Gippites. They'll look at that type of thing and say, well, they said this about it and they said that about it, instead of looking at, myself, because they don't want my understanding to get into their feed, because then people might say, actually, what Nick Sayer said makes sense. And so they don't even want to acknowledge that that's where they got their information from. And it's quite interesting to look at the Easter issue, because most of these guys no longer hold that Easter is a pagan festival. Now, I know some people are coming out and saying, yeah, well, I don't believe it's a pagan festival. See, James White said in his book, it's a pagan festival. Okay. But so did a bunch of King James guys. Now, since I wrote an article about that in 2005, and back when I wrote it, most people had no idea about the issue. And I was bringing it up, and I kept bringing it up, and I was very staunch about it. I made 3 videos on it. And then in 2019, Bryan Ross has written a book about it. And a lot of people are going, well, I go back to Bryan Ross's material, and that's what I think. And it's like, because some people don't want to acknowledge me because I'm not new IFB. I'm not old IFB. I'm like a stray cat, and so they don't want. I'm the sort of guy people listen to, data mine, grab my material, and then sort of make it their own. That's what I've found. But that's cool. I'm not all for accolades and people praising me. If someone did that with Revelation 16:5, that would be a pretty big thing, because most people know me as the Revelation 16:5 guy, where most people didn't know me as the Easter guy, the guy defending Acts chapter 12 verse 4. That was my main thing for many, many years. And now Revelation 16:5, for at least the last 9 years, since I wrote my first article on that. But anyway, let's get into this.
Defense of their view. Neither can Dean Burgon's name, for that matter. I'm very grateful to Dr. Robinson for his time and to Tim Berg's. And
so notice he said, neither can Dean Burgon's name, for that matter. Now, the problem is there is a slight bit of truth in what Mark Ward's saying there, because there is the Dean Burgon Society. Now, I've said this for probably 10 years. I think it's an unfortunate name. I think if D.A. Waite could get in a time machine, he would go back to 1979 when they had their first meeting. They actually wanted to be the Trinitarian Bible Society United States division. But because the Trinitarian Bible Society was sort of stooped in British type of religion, there was a lot of difference between that and what D.A. Waite was involved with. There were quite a lot of restrictions, and so D.A. Waite felt that he would be better off having his own independent movement, and they called it the Dean Burgon Society. Now, I think a lot of people, I've read Dean Burgon, and I've gone, yeah, that's a great point. That's a really good point. That's really good. But then there are these things that crop up with his defense of what is called the traditional text. People think he's defending the TR. He's not. The traditional text is what Dean Burgon labeled basically the majority text. So Dean Burgon, if you understand that he is at the top of the pyramid of the majority text movement, he is the pioneer of that type of movement, okay? So he was the loudest voice in his generation for that. Miller, he finished a lot of his books and works and things like that. Hoskier, he was contemporary with Dean John William Burgon. He said he was defending the Textus Receptus, but then it depends which Textus Receptus, because some people are going back to the 1555, some people are going back to Erasmus and all this sort of stuff. And so, but the majority text movement was started with Burgon. And what you'll find is people like Robertson, people like Pierpont, when you read their material, they're going back to Burgon. And just like a lot of KJV defenders go back to Burgon, these guys go back to Burgon, but they adopt what he's actually really teaching, which is not a TR position. And so this is where Mark Ward can come out and say, well, how can King James people invoke Burgon? And at the end of the day, like the received text of the authorized version is essentially a Byzantine text. For broadly the same reasons, that is, a representative sample of Byzantine texts are used to establish the basic text. The Burgonite majority text is also essentially a Byzantine text, and so agrees with the received text much more frequently than do the Neo-Alexandrian text. That is the NU text, the Nestle-Aland United Bible Society text. So flowing from the much higher number of points of intersecting agreement between the received text and the Burgonite majority text, the much higher regard Burgonites have for the received text than the Neo-Alexandrians have is manifested in the fact that the Burgonites who translated the New King James Version, they were all basically majority text people who were the leadership of that, except for Price, but we'll look at him maybe a little bit later. They used to receive text in the main body of their New Testament in the New King James, even though they introduced a textual apparatus showing diversity from this with a limited selection of both the Neo-Alexandrians and New Text and the Burgonites' majority text readings. So the New King James, what's quite fascinating is a lot of material to do with the Textus Receptus in the past 150 years has been made by people who don't hold to a TR position. And so you'll find, like, even now you'll get people who, like Dwayne Green, he might try and head up a new TR edition that's got all these footnotes and everything, and I'm sort of like, why are you guys fascinated in the Textus Receptus when you reject it? I mean, it's like me doing an ESV study Bible or something with, you know, marginal notes showing variants. It's like, why? You know, if and I know, like, some of these guys follow the New King James, but so on one hand, this means that both the received text advocates and the majority text advocates arrive at the same conclusion on a large number of New Testament texts for basically the same reason. That is, they consider that in broad terms, the Byzantine Greek text is the text providentially preserved by God over the centuries. And so a reading that is representative of the Byzantine text is the preferred reading. But on the other hand, this is a general rule for Neo-Byzantine received text advocates, but an absolute rule for Burgonite majority text advocates, other than where the Byzantine text is split and Burgonites follow the most sizable reading, supra, in which instance they may apply some form of textual analysis to determine the better reading. Where this has been done, sometimes Robinson and Pierpont majority text in the 91 and 2005 agrees with, and at other times disagrees with, Hodges and Farstead majority text 1982 and 1985. So the argument that Jerome's Latin Vulgate preserves an earlier Greek reading so that it had general accessibility over the centuries to that reading, which textual analysis of the Greek indicates was part of the autograph, is not an argument Burgonite majority text advocates would accept if that reading lacked majority text support, with, for example, possibly no Greek manuscript support per se, although they might accept it in the case of a fairly evenly divided majority Greek text. And while Burgon and Miller, so Dean Burgon and Miller was basically his proof writer and wrote a lot of books for him, helped him with a lot of books, and after he died, he actually printed a lot of Burgon's material. They used manuscripts from Greek, Latin, and elsewhere in their majority text count of less than 200 manuscripts. So by contrast, the modern Burgonites, von Soden, the 1913 base majority text of Hodges and Farstead, the 1982 and 1985 editions, and Robinson and Pierpont, the 1991 and 2005 editions, consider only Greek texts are to be used in their majority text counts. Thus, notwithstanding their shared high view of the Byzantine text, diversity emerges over some points of the New Testament between the Neo-Byzantine text, the received text advocates, and Byzantine text, majority text advocates. So there's nothing new or startling about the modern 19th century and following discoveries by Neo-Alexandrian critical texts like Westcott and Hort, or majority text Burgonite critics like J. Green. So you might know J. Green for this monster, Interlinear Bible. I suggest you get it if you haven't got it. That in Acts chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, it came from the Latin Vulgate, or that 1 John 5, 7 and 8 has only slim and late Greek manuscript support, but earlier and much better Latin support, So that's one of the examples that I use. People say, well, it's not in the majority text. So all of a sudden, these critical text guys become interested in the majority text when the TR doesn't have a majority reading. And so I'm like, when did you become a majority text advocate? Because why aren't you holding the mirror up to your own face? And why aren't you rejecting a bunch of readings in the critical text due to it not being in the majority? Because that they just have this strange thing that, the majority text overrides any TR reading where there is a minority TR reading. And it's like, well, why are you so concerned about the majority text all of a sudden? And so we're going to look at those things tonight, and we're going to sort a lot of that out. And so, yeah, with 1 John 5:7, I usually just say, well, 95% of the Latin manuscripts have the reading, which is a huge majority. So why aren't they going with that? Oh, it's almost like Latin doesn't exist. Now, the other day, someone was pointing out to me, because if you have skin the same tone as mine, sometimes you can feel like, you horrible colonialist. And people have even come over from Ireland, and they're like, hey, we didn't even own slaves or anything. We picked our own potatoes, and what? And then they move to America, and all of a sudden they've got to feel guilty for what's happened to people who look a certain way, and it's like, hang on. And but one person pointed out recently, he said, do you know who the biggest majority is in the world? Is white people. Because if you look on a global scale, not just on a local scale or country to country, if you go on a global scale, there's a lot more of other people than there is of white people. And so white people are the minority. So we are the minority on a global scale. So you can officially, if you're a white person, you can say, hey, I'm a minority. When people ask you, they say, oh, so, well, where do you come from? Just say, I'm a minority. And so, oh, what do you mean? It's like, well, white people are a minority. I'm a minority. And so the reason that I'm saying that is because these people are looking, the majority text, but they're only looking at the Byzantine Greek text. What about all the Latin manuscripts? What about all the early church writings? When you have early church writings that say that the pericope adulteri is being removed from the text, or 1 John 5:7 is being taken out, like Jerome said this, it's been taken out by unfaithful scribes, that has to be taken into consideration. But these guys don't. They just go, well, where's that today? And so, and as I've mentioned, another quote from Dan Wallace, he's clearly said, if you found the preamble for the Constitution of the United States of America and it said, we the people, in order to form a more perfect onion, you would know, hang on, he's not talking about a cooking class here. He's talking about the union. And so it most probably means union. It doesn't mean onion. That's just a typo, so, but you would know that instinctively. And so this is the thing. When you look at some of these readings, the Bible itself fixes those problems. It's the whole thing about Luke 2:22. In the majority text, they go with the reading, their purification. Jesus, Joseph, and Mary all had to be purified. All you have to do is read Leviticus. I think it's Leviticus 12. The whole chapter has her purification like about 10 times. And if you read that through in the Greek, so-called Septuagint, you see her purification is clearly there in the Greek, exactly as the TR has it. So in no way, shape, or form did any of the men, did baby Jesus or Joseph, have to be purified at all. And so it's clearly for her purification. And so when you understand these things, that there is internal consistency with the Textus Receptus that's not in these other texts, this is one of the reasons why what happened in the Reformation was so good and so special, because people were looking at all of these issues. They were looking at grammatical arguments. I don't think any of these guys have the skills to spot when there are grammatical issues, where there are solecisms in the text. most of these guys, they can sort of fudge around with a dictionary, with a interlinear on their lap sort of thing. And this comes out in a lot of their teaching, where you'll hear of a teaching, you'll just go, actually, that's just from reading the interlinear. If you knew the Greek in that particular spot, you would know that it means this thing, or it's a Hebrew idiom that's been carried over into the Greek. Or so Jay Green uses this. So basically, the majority text position. So let me go through the majority text position. Okay. I know I'm only 1 minute into Mark Ward talking, and I'm already on a huge rant for like half an hour. The majority text position, let me just read the beginning of Harry Stirs. Okay, so he kind of sums up what this text is. So what Byzantine is. Byzantine refers to that type of text which categorizes the majority of the later uncial, semi-uncial, and minuscule manuscripts of the New Testament. It is also the type of text found in the Syriac Peshitta, Gothic versions, and in the extant quotations of the Church Fathers from Chrysostom on. So it's about the 4th century. This text derives its name from the provenance or origin of most of its manuscripts, the Byzantine Empire. It has, in addition to Byzantine, so listen to this, being called Antiochian after the supposed place of its origin, and the Lucian recension after its supposed editor. It is Semler's Oriental, Bengal's Asiatic, Griesbach's Constantinopolitan, Westcott and Hort's Syrian, and Burgon's traditional. Okay, so it's very important when Burgon's defending the traditional text. He's not defending the TR. He's defending the Byzantine text. Okay. Other designations of the same include von Soden and Merck's K, standing for Koine or common text, Legrande's A, and Kenyon's Alpha. It is largely the text behind the Textus Receptus and King James Version. In this book, the Byzantine text will be referred to more or less indiscriminately by the use of several of the above terms, etc. So I just sort of say that because names are very important. When we say Textus Receptus, like someone like Mark Ward, he says there are like 100 different texti recepti and all this sort of stuff. Where I'm very clear, the underlying Greek text of the King James Version is the Textus Receptus that I would consider akin to the originals. Okay. Now, some people think that FHA Scrivener, in his edition, that he nailed it and that's it. Where I would say he did a very, very good job at it, but there are a few little sprinklings of Scrivener's own opinions in there which I don't agree with. So I still just go, well, where is my King James? Here it is. The underlying Greek text of this is where the Hebrew Masoretic text is, and the Textus Receptus is, that is providentially preserved, and I believe that the underlying text is akin to the originals. And so when it comes to, say, Mark Ward saying, oh, which TR, I've just answered him, okay. But he would prefer to go to a lot of other people who sort of, dance around it and say, oh, well, we're not really sure. And, it could be Erasmus's, or it could be the Complutensian polyglot reading here, and it could be, this and that, or Beza's 1598, that's close. And it's like, well, I'm very specific with that. Okay. And a lot of other people are too. A lot of other people have that now. Hills, he said exactly the same thing. But he believed it was that Scrivener had basically produced that text. And so where I believe Scrivener's nearly produced that text. There's just a few little crumbs of stuff that I'm not happy with. But apart from that, if I was to grab that text, I would say that is the best representative that we have. And so what about the majority text, the label majority text? Now, the Textus Receptus sometimes was called the Greek Vulgate. Okay. So if I said to you, oh, the Greek Vulgate, this and that, you mightn't even know what I'm talking about. Okay. So in text criticism circles, the majority text was a name for the Textus Receptus. So when people said, "Oh, we don't accept the majority text reading there," they're actually saying we don't accept the Textus Receptus reading there. So wind the clock forward like 100 years, and someone actually printed a thing called the called the majority text. Okay, so basically, you've got something that's like a TR, say it's the Elzevers or Beezers or even Scriveners. And it's like, okay, that's a Textus Receptus, and people are calling it the majority text. Okay, so then fast forward a few years, and you get J. Green turn up with this big beast. So this has got the Hebrew Masoretic text in it. It's got interlinear. He's got his own translation. It's very helpful. I've enjoyed it for many years. I've had a copy of this since the 90s, and so I've enjoyed it, and I used to photocopy it and take bits to work and look at things, and it's very interesting. But at the back here, I'm going to enlarge my screen, and everything goes backwards on this, so forgive me if I can't do this as good as you would want it. Notice it says the majority text notes and how to use them. So it's got a whole heap of how to use the majority text notes, and then it's got a whole bunch of majority text notes down the bottom. And this goes for quite a few pages. And so this is the thing that Maurice Robinson, he talks about this, that this is what he was following, these majority text notes. And so this is the beginnings of the modern day, or how do you have a more modern day? I guess it's like Burgon started the modern day majority text movement by defending the Byzantine text and not really the TR. Then people came along 1950s, 60s, and 70s talking about the majority text and saying that it's basically the Byzantine text. And so obviously the Textus Receptus, with its label, the majority text, that had faded away somewhere in between there. And so you've got people like Pickering, and so he is talking about the majority text as well. And see, sometimes these are called Syrian readings, Greek Syrian readings, and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of different names. But it's very important that you know that the Textus Receptus was named the majority text. Okay? Because then when Hodges and Farsted, who basically created the New King James, when they did their majority text, they labeled it majority text on the cover. This is the majority text. So then you got people like James White and Dan Wallace saying, well, the King James and the Textus Receptus differ from the majority text. So why are King James people saying that they're based upon, the King James is based on the majority text? It's not. And it's like, no, you've done a bit of a shuffle here. The shell game. So they put the majority text there. It has formerly meant Textus Receptus. Then over the years, it's come to just mean the Byzantine text. Okay. And everyone's been aware that the Textus Receptus and the Byzantine text have differences in them, because the Textus Receptus in the Reformation period had 3 pillars. Now remember this. It had the Greek, and that was the primary thing to look at. Look at Erasmus. He wouldn't even put the Comiohanium in without Greek evidence, and he was given Greek evidence as support, so he put it in. Then the Latin. Okay, so the Greek is primary. The Greek corrects the Latin, but the Latin polishes the Greek. Then we have the witness of the early church writers. So that guides the whole entire process. And so when you have these three together, you have three within the closed class of witnesses for the correct reading. Okay. Now, then you also can go outside of the closed class of witnesses, looking at the Arabic, looking at the Syrian, looking at the Ethiopic, looking at other things. But that's outside of the closed class of witnesses. So what you see, the Textus Receptus, Erasmus was the leading world expert in Latin. Then he became the leading world expert in Greek. So who else is better qualified to look at Latin and Greek? No one. He was the man. He was the dude to do that. And so people are like, well, he was a Catholic, and all this stuff. It's like, yeah, well, so was Martin Luther. Martin Luther, he didn't just all of a sudden just become Protestant. He dropped off things over the years. Now, Erasmus, he never really officially exited from the Roman Catholic Church. And he was at loggerheads with Luther over issues of salvation and things like that. And, there were specific things that they were debating upon. He wasn't going to go and join the Lutherans because they had a huge disagreement. But on a lot of other things, they were in agreement. And so what you got to look at, someone like Tyndale, he actually just got Erasmus's work, translated it into English, like what was his work on being a soldier for Christ, and also the New Testament, and revival started, and he becomes the father of the Protestant movement in England just by printing a few of Erasmus's works. It's quite amazing. So who is the main font there? Who's the main source? It's Erasmus. Luther just prints his text from Erasmus, and it's like it sparks huge, massive revival in Germany. Tyndale does the same in England. Everyone wants this New Testament. They're reading it. They're following it. Whose work originally was it? It was Erasmus's work. And so, and all of these guys who were very intelligent guys revered Erasmus as a great scholar. So, was Erasmus a squeaky clean angel? No. He had his issues. He had his problems. But had Martin Luther been killed when he got kidnapped, he still would have held to a lot of Roman Catholic ideals. So some people, it just takes them longer to get out of things. Other people, they stagnate. Like I think Luther, he got 4 or 5 major things right, and the rest of the things I'm like, no, I don't know about this and that. But I'm glad for the things that he got right. And the same with Erasmus. These guys, there wasn't like you just had this pop-up church on the corner that you could go to. The Spanish Inquisition didn't mess around, and they had Erasmus in 1527 in the Council of Valladolid. They were doing a heresy trial for Erasmus, saying this guy's a heretic. And so, he had to watch his P's and Q's wherever he went. But at the end of the day, when you read his material, is very critical of the Roman Catholic Church. He said a pope went to hell. A pope went. He did a whole thing on the pope going to hell. So it's like he's not afraid to just say certain things, but then he stooped in Mariolatry, which is unfortunate. But at the end of the day, what happened through a lot of his work is that Calvin was very influenced by Erasmus and his teachings. And so Calvin, Beza, Unius, Tremellius, eventually all these reformers and post-reformers, they escaped from the clutches of Roman Catholicism. But see, in my eyes, they didn't escape enough. There's still a lot that needed reforming. But that's in the eye of the beholder. Some people are Reformed and Calvinists and all the rest of it. But and so, at the end of the day, the majority text is a label. It's a modern day label put upon something that used to be called the Textus Receptus. So you've got to take that into consideration when these guys talk about these things. You've got to remember this in your mind. Okay, so let's continue with Mark.
And I hope you feel the same way.
Dr. Robinson, it was just a privilege to chat with you.
Yeah.
And we really enjoyed last night. Now I know why Elijah talks about you so much. And I just want to talk with you about the King James Version. I want to talk about King James onlyism because, as you, I think, well
listen to this.
know, the King James only movement tends to use you as an authority.
The King James only movement tends to use you as an authority. The reason is because, see, these guys are trying to find the text. They don't know where the Bible is. None of these guys do. And so they're fumbling over words, fumbling over manuscripts. They're trying to figure out what the reading is. And in that process, they have to have good argumentation as to why their reading should be accepted by people. And so for someone like Maurice Robinson, he was birthed, his scholarship was birthed in the critical text environment. So for him to come out and say the Pericope Adulterae is genuine, he has to have a very good case for that. So he studied this for years. And see, someone like me, I'm just like, well, the King James has it, the TR has it. It's very well attested. I can look at a whole bunch of things, and I can even come up with some of the ideas that Maurice Robinson has. But see, these guys would never listen to that, would they? They would just go, Nick Sayers has just got a bias. He has his favorite text. He's not really even interested in the scholarship behind it. It's whatever the TR has, and that's it. Where they would look at Maurice Robinson and say, well, he's going to go with what the science says, sort of thing. That's how they view him. So when we're like, okay, well, he's in agreement with us, of course we're going to use his arguments. Why wouldn't we? If Richard Dawkins turned around and said, hey, or even a lot of people use Darwin's arguments like for the eye, of the eye being so complex, and if how can an eye evolve and all this sort of stuff, and these were questions that Darwin talked about. So we use those type of arguments when we're talking to atheists. It's not that we really like Darwin and we like his argumentation, but they respect Darwin. These guys respect Maurice Robinson. They just said, oh, Elijah Hixson says this about you and that. They're fawning over him. So we're just pointing out, going, okay, so he believes in probably half of the TR readings that I defend. He believes in about half of them. So why aren't you listening to his scholarship? That's all we're doing. But they want to make out like it's some sort of criminal thing. Like, we're just, we just got, the Richard Dawkins guy. He's on our side. It's like, no, sometimes Richard Dawkins can say things that help our cause. And we might say to an atheist, do you realize Richard Dawkins even said this and said that? And so we would point out that one of their favorite scholars, who they often talk about, and they're interviewing here, so they obviously respect him. When I'm talking about the Pericope Adulterae, I just go, well, I agree with him. It's not like, or we're saying he's King James only, or they're trying to make out that we're saying he's part of a King James only camp, or we're trying to make him out to be one of our scholars or something like that. We have a text. These guys don't. They don't have a text at all.
They say that they adopt the majority text, like August Dr. Robinson.
See, notice, they say that they adopt the majority text. Now, I admit there has been confusion over that. Like I've just mentioned, the majority text was a name for the Textus Receptus. So some people reading older material, they get confused about that. They're like, majority text, I thought that was the Byzantine text, because this name has shuffled around. It's a bit like a woman who's been married to John Smith and Dave Smith. It's like, there's confusion there. It's like, which Smith family are you? It's a common type of name. This is just basically a label that people oftentimes get tripped up on. They hear majority text, that now they're thinking of the Byzantine text, but many years ago they used to think of the Textus Receptus. And so sometimes people still think that because they're reading older material and they're bringing it into today. So there's this mixture of a lot of things. So, but at the end of the day, there is some truth to it that some TR defenders just basically go for the majority text route. And that is not always the position of TR defenders, okay? Like I said before, this is a general rule for the received text advocate, but it's an absolute rule for the Burgonite majority text advocate. So we don't necessarily just, it's either majority text or it's not. No, we do look at the majority and we go, okay, well, say the last 12 verses of Mark, we go, well, there's only 2 manuscripts that don't have it. And these are 2 manuscripts which we have a very, very low opinion of, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. And so the vast majority of everything else, it's there, And so sometimes we're making a majority text argument, but most of the time it's not just a majority. It's not just a head count. And at the end of the day, the critical text people are not interested in majority text. They have about 50 manuscripts that back up their core readings. Okay, so there's about, well, let me put it this way: there's about 50 manuscripts that they have that would be considered Alexandrian manuscripts. The rest of them are Byzantine. And so they have very little interest in the Byzantine text, in the majority text, except for when it comes against, the King James and the Textus Receptus. And people have answered these questions years and years and years ago. D.A. Waite has done a pretty good job at answering a lot of this. Say someone like Jack Mormon, who's passed away now, he wrote a book about where the Textus Receptus departs from the majority text. So he focused in on that, and he wrote a whole entire book on that. And so I would encourage, if people have a problem with this whole arena, just read those books. It's very they're very informative. And at the end of the day, as I've mentioned, these guys, Burgon and Miller, they used about 200 manuscripts. The von Soden count, that was about 400 manuscripts, 300 to 400 manuscripts. And so that was what Hodges and Fasted was based on, and Robinson and Pierpont. Now, they're doing more and more collation of manuscripts as we go along. But at the end of the day, to have an absolute majority text, they haven't looked at all the manuscripts yet. So once they've done that, then they can go, okay, well, this is a majority in every place. And so they're still working all that out. And as I mentioned, they're not looking at Latin. They're not looking at the early church writers, which is exactly what the Reformers did. The Reformers looked at these things. They looked at the Latin as a representation of Greek, as a translation of the Greek, but even more than a translation of the Greek, something that preserved the Greek. It's a bit like I say, the King James, the underlying Greek text of the King James, preserve the Greek text underlying it is akin to the originals. And so I've got a lot of how do you say it? Respect for this. And so the Reformers had a lot of respect for the Latin. And even if you look at what the Roman Catholics came up with in, say, the Clementine Vulgate, which is sort of the definitive Vulgate for them, they still have 1 John 5:7 there. They still have the Comia Henium there. The Principe Adulterae there. They have the last 12 verses of Mark there. They have all these readings in there. So it's not hugely different from the Protestant text. Yes, there are differences, and there's enough differences for the Reformers and the Catholics to be at loggerheads for many, many years about those issues. But yeah, these guys are on a different level. They're arguing something that's completely foreign to the Reformation period, because they're not looking outside of anything but Greek. It's like, well, what? So, and what's quite amazing is when I see majority text people, they'll teach about homoioteiton, they'll teach about homoiarchton, the similar beginnings, homoioteiton, similar endings, parablepsis, things like that. But then when it comes to an example of that, like say the TR might have fixed something, it's like that's obvious that they've skipped a line there, or they've added a line there, or they've done something wrong. People have realized it's a parablepsis, which is just a fault of the eye, or a similar beginning or ending has caused them to do this. And they teach this, but they rarely ever have an example of this that we can go, yeah, that's in real time, that's what we're following. Because the Textus Receptus does this and says this is homoioteiton, so the text has been fixed. Then they're like, where's the manuscript evidence for this? And it's like, no, didn't you hear me? It's homoioteiton, so it's got the similar endings there. So the scholar who's worked on this for many years has worked out that that's homoioteiton and fixed that reading there. And they teach that you can do that, but when it comes to the real a real example of that, rarely can they show you it, or they'll fight against it in the TR.
When somebody in the King James only world tries to invoke your authority, what do you say?
Well, I'm sure that, say someone who believed in Aramaic primacy, if they adopted my Revelation 16:5 material, they mightn't adopt all the TR things and King James things that I believe, but they might say, yeah, it's got the name I am there. I think shall be is a good reading there. I think that's part of an expansion of the nomina sacra that's there, and so I think that's a good, genuine reading. I wouldn't say, oh, they're invoking me, sort of thing. It's like, well, they've just data mined and gotten the most logical answer. And that's all we're doing with this guy, Maurice Robinson. I mean, if this guy knocked on my door and said, hey, I've got a Bible for you, I'd say, well, I don't need your new Bible. I think this guy and these other text critics are committing sin. When it says in Revelation chapter 22, verses 18 to 19, if you add or take away from these words, your part will be taken from the book of life. What else can that mean? And so but if he's saying stuff that's for my position, it's like, okay, just as much as, if Bart Ehrman said something that was in agreement with my position, I go, okay, well, Bart Ehrman said this, and then if I was talking to an atheist, I'd say, well, even Bart Ehrman said that, So that's all people are invoking Maurice Robinson for. It's because he's doing all this scholarship, and it's like, well, it's in agreement with us. Cool, we'll adopt that.
Well, the first shocker that comes to them probably is that I've never used the King James. The first Bible I started using was a Revised Standard Version, which
a Revised Standard Version with, virgin removed and young girl put in there.
Obviously didn't even follow the TR, let alone the Byzantine text, and I used that for...
So he didn't follow the TR or the Byzantine text?
For at least 8 years before I moved to anything else, and my text critical views at that time were still reasoned eclecticism, as I had talked about previously.
So he was a reasoned eclectic. So he had basically his scholarship was birthed in the critical text movement.
So,
and as you'll see, he is in complete agreement with the critical text argumentation against the TR. Where at least someone like James Snap Jr., he seems to have hung around more King James guys and TR people, where he's sort of learned a few lessons over the years, and he doesn't use silly arguments at times, but then he turns around and just has a, a real doozy. But it's like, anyway.
Even after I went to a Byzantine text position, I certainly didn't do it on the basis of the TR or the King James. I did use a Berry's interlinear when I was first learning Greek.
So that would be this one, or actually.
But like I said,
it said berries. So that is, I'll just zoom that in. This is berries here, which basically has the Greek, English underneath, and then it has the King James on one side. And so
on the other interview, what I followed was the footnotes, which continually departed from the TR.
Okay, so he's saying he followed the footnotes. So what you'll see is just pick any random page. You'll see down the bottom, it has all these footnotes. So say where it has on this top line, but over the other side, it says, ye shall be, and it has LTTRAW. So they're all like Ruckman, Tregelles, Tischendorf, and I can't remember the other ones, but it's like, so he's following them. And what you're going to notice is some contradictory statements in what Maurice Robinson says here. So,
and the King James. So I never was attached to the King James, and
listen to this.
I realize it can be a literary masterpiece, but so is Shakespeare. But, I'm the kind of guy that I'd like that edition of Shakespeare, the No Fear edition, where they have modernized the English so I can understand it all without having to see the little footnotes everywhere.
And so he's sort of, I guess mocking like the Trinitarian Bible Society one where it has, footnotes everywhere and helps for the King James. But wasn't he just sort of saying this was his first one with all these footnotes, and he would follow this and the footnotes? So he doesn't mind going through Greek and having a smorgasbord of different readings at the bottom from Tregelles, from Ruckman, from Westcott and Hort, from other TR editions. I think it's the Elizabeth edition. And it's like, but, the English, if you have to look up a word, if you have to have a footnote, that's really, really bad. It's like, no, I think you just contradicted yourself there, because you were saying that you were using the berries with the footnotes and you were following the footnotes in Greek. But then when it comes to English, having a footnote here and there, that's really bad. And so it doesn't make for good argumentation. Anyway, I spotted a few of these contradictions that just popped up every now and then. They're not really huge, but they just sort of show that it's sort of like anything but the King James.
Right.
So I'm not a great proponent of the King James, and I'm surprised if they actually try to cite me, because the TR, even underlying the King James, is hardly equal to the Byzantine text.
But you would have to admit, it's way closer to the Textus Receptus than the critical text. And so the critical text is about 94% of the Textus Receptus, while the majority text is 98%. So you've got quite a lot of readings that would overlap. And so that's why if someone's keeping their finger on the pulse, like say for example, Tommy Wasserman, who I would not really ever follow. He doesn't believe in a literal hell, as he mentioned on the Bart Ehrman blog. But he has collated all the manuscripts of Jude. Okay, so where there are readings that the critical text and the King James would agree, I could look at that material and go, yeah, that's that supports what we're saying too, because it's they're both saying the same thing. So what's wrong with doing that? And Mark Ward's sort of like, well, no, all scholarship is ours, sort of thing, and like if you were to go to Tommy Wasserman and say, "Oh, King James people are using your material," it's no, we're just data mining, going around, and someone says truth, we follow it. If someone says rubbish and lies, like these guys do, we dismiss it and we say we're not going to follow that. And so Jay Green, he supports the majority text in this huge interlinear. And this includes Green's majority text textual apparatus, as I showed you. So this was composed by Pierpont. Okay. This shows when a majority text reading at variance with the Textus Receptus has 95 to 100% manuscript support, 80 to 94% manuscript support, or 61 to 79% manuscript support. In the Book of Revelation only, where the majority text support is at 61 to 79%, a symbol also indicates when the received text has very weak manuscript support. Green's majority text textual apparatus also includes a list of alternatives where the evidence is about evenly divided at 40 to 60% manuscript support. These calculations by Pierpont are generalist and provide only a broad brush guide, but are nevertheless a useful indicator. So Jay Green, who followed Dean John William Burgon, says of the received text used in the main text, the text retains a few readings from the Latin Vulgate, 2 or 3 without Greek manuscript authority, Acts 9, 5-6, and 1 from the Complutensian Bible, 1 John 5:7. Although we do not accept these as true scripture, we have allowed them to remain. The appendix with the majority text textual apparatus must serve as the needed corrective. So similar comments are found in the New King James Version, in which the Burgonite preface says the majority text, the M text, corrects those readings which have little or no support in the Greek manuscript tradition. So that's in the NKJV preface. So then, for example, at Acts 9:5, a footnote says NU text and M text omit the last sentence of verse 5 and and begin verse 6 with, but arise and go. Likewise, a footnote at 1 John 5, 7 and 8 says NU text and M text omit the words in heaven, verse 7, through to on earth in verse 8. Only 4 or 5 very late manuscripts contain these words in Greek. So that's in the New King James. So the Burgonite Zane Hodges is the joint composer of the modern majority text. Like other majority text advocates, this Burgonite has a much higher regard for the received text than do Neo-Alexandrians, but he is still critical of the received text in favor of the majority text. Hence, for example, Hodges claims it is hoped that the general Christian reader following the majority text will start accepting corrections to his authorized version which are not supported by a large majority of manuscripts. So by contrast, others such as the Trinitarian Bible Society have defended the received text and authorized version. At the local church level, numerous churches have decided to use the authorized version, and some are known as AV only churches. However, this type of view has been adopted at a denominational level by the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, which stated, we hold the doctrine of the inerrancy and verbal inspiration of Scripture. And so this is still reading Gavin McGrath's material. So he talks a fair bit about the Presbyterian Church, and then he goes on to 1 John 5:7 and talking about that and how that's affecting the Presbyterian Church. So I'll just keep going with this interview, but I'll keep reading some of Gavin McGrath's material on the Burgonites and Jay Green and a few other guys. And so let's continue.
They differ probably in around 1,400 or so places. And many of them are significant.
So can you distinguish from your perspective as a leading proponent of a Byzantine priority position? I'm not just a leading proponent, the leading proponent. You've given a lot of honor to your partner there, William Pierpont, who worked on the Robinson Pierpont edition. But can you distinguish, as King James onlyism commonly does not, among the Byzantine family, the majority text, and the Textus Receptus? I commonly hear, and Tim, don't you as well,
For sure.
all of those three things blurred completely together.
So it's blurred completely together by some King James defenders, TR defenders, and so that's wrong. We should be very nuanced in how we defend our position. But it's actually critical text people who are blurring these lines. James White is just, he doesn't tell people that the majority text was a name for the Textus Receptus, like the Greek Vulgate and other names were for the TR. And also how Dean John William Burgon defended the traditional text and the TR and all this sort of stuff. And so this sort of stuff just needs to be known across the board. And I've said this for like 10 more years. And so the material that I'm reading is 2010 by a fellow Australian. And so, but let's let Maurice answer this, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about J. Green, and then Erasmus and Beza and the authorized version translators.
Well, you can start historically with the TR. And the TR, we understand how it was put together by Erasmus with his limited number of manuscripts.
So straight away, the limited number of manuscripts. Not that this was a world-leading scholar who had access to the Byzantine school in Venice, who had access to all of Aldus Manutius material in his print shop, who lived with Aldus for 7 months and was a proofreader in his print shop, and was also considered a leading representative of the Byzantine school filled with native Byzantine scholars who, like, people were helping Aldus Manutius, people were talking about scripture, talking about different books and things like that, and Erasmus slotted in there, and the Greeks viewed Erasmus as a leading Greek scholar, and his Atticus editions were coming out, and so he did I think it was at first 3,000 proverbs in Greek, sort of like it's raining cats and dogs, and a lot of English proverbs come from Erasmus, and so he was translating. He was doing these in Greek, but he was translating these over as well into Latin, I think. And then eventually these became translated into English, and they became hugely popular in England. So a lot of sayings come directly from Greek, from Erasmus. How did he know these? Well, he was talking with native Greek scholars, the Byzantine school. So Aldus Manutius, he was printing Greek books. So he was, you name it. Most of the ancient classics were printed by Aldus Manutius. He was definitely the one who saved the Greek language from just dying a painful death during that time, because it took quite a while for the Greek language to be printed, because there were 1,000 different typeset letters that need to be made to print the Greek language, and so that's why it took so long for it to be for Greek to start to be printed. But Aldus Manutius, he was basically the main guy of that era for printing Greek, and Erasmus lived with him. Erasmus lived with Paulos Bombasius. Bombasius later on was the curator for the Vatican Library, where Vaticanus was held. So he was going around, like Maurice Robinson's basically saying he had a limited number of manuscripts. What, did he have to keep these manuscripts? You know what I mean? Like, did he have to go to a library and say, hey, I want to keep this forever. No, he would go to the library. He would have open access to wherever he went. He was revered as the leading Latin and Greek scholar of that day. So when he went to a library, they were like, Erasmus is here. Let's show him our treasures. They were opening books, showing him manuscripts. And when he was in England, there was a whole bunch of manuscripts he would have looked at there. And he was copying variant readings, looking at variant readings, looking at them in Latin, looking at them in Greek. And he used to be a scribe in Latin, copying Latin manuscripts. So he knew firsthand about scribal errors and things like that. I don't think these guys have ever done that. I don't think, like, if I placed Maurice Robinson in Thessaloniki and said, hey, can you order a gyros and can you call a taxi? I don't think they could do that. And I don't think they could communicate to any Greek in any era of Greece, ancient Greek, Koine Greek, modern Greek, none of them. Yes, they can fumble around with the Greek dictionary and they can tell, oh, that word means this and that word means that, and they can count how many times this word was used by Luke and others, but it's like they're not fluent in the language. And so here's Erasmus, completely fluent in Latin, writing books in Greek, 3,000 proverbs in Greek. Where's he getting these from? And this is before he went to Venice. So very learned, brilliant guy. But he just had a limited number of manuscripts. So these are the anecdotes that you're going to hear about Erasmus. Constantly, you're going to hear, he didn't have enough manuscripts. It's like, well, how many is enough? And when you listen to James White, he'll say, or Dan Wallace will say he had 5 manuscripts. Then James White will say, he had between 6 and 12. Then if you really press him, he'll say, well, he probably had access to 20. So they're just making this number up. He was going through all the libraries of Europe. So, he's Erasmus of Rotterdam. Then he lived in England. Then he went over to Venice. Then he was in Rome. And then he was in Basel. He was all over the place. He was in Paris and he was in communication with Luther. He's in communication. The Complutensian polyglot guys wanted to hire him. They wanted him on their team. They're like, this guy's brilliant. Bring him on board. But he was like, no, I don't like Spain. I think he didn't like the Spanish Inquisition because he was saying the Pope went to hell and all this sort of stuff. So, he just had a few manuscripts. Okay, so what proof? Can you please prove that he only had a few manuscripts and that's all he used? Or is it more so that at his fingertips he had a handful of manuscripts, but he had other books that had been 15, 20 years of learning and going through libraries? What do you think he's going through the library and just reading a book and going, that was great? He's writing variants. When they confiscated his material, when he came from England to the continent, they confiscated his books, and he clearly said, they've taken my life's work. What would that be? Well, writing down variants and showing differences in manuscripts and things like that, which he clearly talks about. He talks about so many different manuscripts and things like that. He talks about having access to Valor and Valor's annotations, and Manetti's Latin, which Manetti, about 70 years before Erasmus, he did a Latin translation that was based upon Greek manuscripts. And so what you'll find is a lot of these Latin readings in Manetti's edition are very similar to Erasmus, but he was only using Greek material. So what manuscripts did he use? And do we have them today? Dan Wallace said that in World War II alone, 1 million biblical manuscripts were destroyed. That's Dan Wallace saying that in the Credo course on textual criticism. So either he's lying or and when I quote Dan Wallace, it's not because I like Dan. It's because I'm trying to appeal to these guys and say, well, even Dan Wallace says this. So what about in World War One? So what about when Napoleon actually stole Vaticanus and he actually returned it and said it's sort of pretty useless? They were grabbing manuscripts all over the place. And so, wars were happening. The Great Fire of London, 1666. There was basically a museum set up for the King James Bible, and it burnt to the ground with all the notes and everything about the King James Bible. Not all of them, but now we have, we're getting more and more as time goes along, but it would have been so much better just to have all that. But it got burnt to the ground in 1666. So things get destroyed. Floods come, fires come, famines, plagues, wars. It's like things get destroyed. And so these guys are like, well, today we have these manuscripts. And so what you'll find is these guys believe that the providence of God in preserving his text is that he preserves the manuscripts and he preserves the doctrines, where Jesus was clear that he is preserving his words. It says, heaven and earth will pass away, my words shall not pass away. So we believe his words have been kept pure in all ages. His words have been with us. His words have been accessible. And so if all the manuscripts were to be destroyed tomorrow, we've got the words. You know what I mean? So these guys are only going on extant evidence. They don't know what Erasmus used. They don't know what Stephanus used. They're still trying to figure that out. Even though he wrote an extensive apparatus, they're sort of like, well, there's a few manuscripts, so we have no idea what they were. And that's just on what he mentioned that he was looking at, let alone all the other things that he had. Beza, he was looking at a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And there are manuscripts that he mentions that up until recently, no one even really knew about. For the last 200 years, people have been saying he made up stuff in Revelation 16:5. Well, we pointed out that in his Annotationis, he's clearly said that he had a manuscript. But unfortunately, critical text guys just go, no, that doesn't go with our story. We've had a story for like 150 years. Let's just pretend that hasn't happened. And how about we even just make up something and say maybe Beza's a liar? Or maybe he tricked himself. He was like a Joe Biden moment, slipped on a banana peel, hit his head, and thought he had a manuscript. This is a sort of ridiculous and anecdotes about Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, the King James translators, King James himself. And, if they're going to mock those legendary scholars, what are they going to say about us?
Some of them were very representative of a Byzantine text. He did not always.
Some of them were representative of a Byzantine text. What else was there? What did he have? He looked at Vaticanus, through Bombasius and Sepultiva, but he used Byzantine manuscripts.
We follow all these manuscripts, and where they differed, he made some decisions. In some other places, he made conjectures, which is not even textual criticism.
He made conjectures, which is not even textual criticism. So someone who wouldn't even put 1 John 5:7 in unless he had it there in the Greek, he's just making conjectures. So this is the contradiction that critical text people and majority text people, they make up stories about Erasmus that don't even make sense. Why then didn't he just go, hey, Communionium's in almost every Latin manuscript, let's just put it in? If he was just back translating from the Latin like they claim, why didn't he just do that? They can't answer that because their story contradicts itself, because they're just trying to make up anything. So this is the thing. The Textual Confidence Collective, Westcott and Hort have been slandered. They didn't go to 100 seances. They only went to one. oh, they didn't, you know, it. When you go through it, like I went through the Textual Confidence Collective going, well, maybe they'll point out that these guys were, strong believers and all the rest of it, but they just had a few associates who were just off the wall. I went through the videos and I'm like, man, these guys are absolutely whacked. I would not have these people involved with any church ministry or anything, let alone making a Bible. These guys are just off the wall. But what about the lies and slander about Erasmus, about Beza, about the King James translators, about, there's plenty of them.
Yeah, Revelation 16:5.
Revelation 16:5. Well, Maurice Robinson better get with the program and realize that Theodore Beza said he had a manuscript for that. So this is the thing. And not only that, but understanding that shall be, the one which art and wast and shall be, is part of a formula which is the exact etymology of Jehovah. So when you get the name Jehovah, which means, to be, haba, to be, when you have the I am said 3 times in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Then in verse 15, it says, my name is Jehovah. The I am is the etymology of Jehovah. When you expand that, it is the past, the present, and the future form, which the perfect representation of that is in Revelation 16:5. So it is a sacred name. It's a nomina, so it's a name, and it's a sacra. Now, if you were to just get a Spiros is on Haiti's word study. If you were to go through that and look up where it has the one who was and is to come, he's got 2.5 pages on it. And he says it's nominative, it's a name, and it's the name of Jehovah, the most sacred name. So to think that someone wrote holy there to indicate that it's a nomina sacra, it explains the rise of all the other variant readings in other manuscripts. A lot of manuscripts just say holy. Some of them say shall be. Some of them say who is and shall be. Some of them say who was and shall be. Some of them say who is and was and holy, or was and is and holy. And so they have all these different readings. But if you understand it's a nomina sacra, then clearly that needs to be expanded as a full name, because you don't just get the name of God and just only say 2 parts of it. You say the whole thing. And so, but yeah, they should look at that as strong internal evidence. And I think if I was actually a majority text guy and I come up with this, I think they would go, yeah, they would probably look at it. But because it's, oh, no, he's a TR guy, he's a King James guy, let's just not even entertain any of that whatsoever. Now, what I'm saying is not strange, it's not bizarre. Theodore Beza, he went with that reading, and he said he had an ancient manuscript of good faith that had that reading in it. He very clearly said that, and many other people quoting him in that era said that he said that. So he had a manuscript with that in it, or an ancient manuscript. Okay, so basically, and I'll debate Robinson on this, Mark Ward, Tim. I'll debate all 3 of them. I'll debate 100 guys. I don't care how many, because I know I'm right. The name is a nomina sacra. Okay, and so it is the etymology of I am. It's the expansion of the name of Jehovah. And this is very clear when you study this. And Theodore Beza clearly said he had an ancient manuscript. Now, some people have gone, well, there's one manuscript that has it. What? That's not a majority. Well, if you understand what nomina sacra is, then basically every manuscript has that reading. If you understand the nomina sacra, because it's such a huge name. Ho'on kaho'en kaho'echomenos, esomenos. Kahun, kaho'en, kaho'esomenos is the whole name. How are you going to condense that and put a line above it? Maybe just put holy on the end. And so this is where holy entered in, because sacred is nomina sacra. It's a name, nomina sacra, sacred, holy. So people wrote holy on the end of it. If you understand how Jehovah was translated and transmitted through the ages from the Hebrew Bible into like Syriac, into many other ancient Bibles, and even into the modern era, you can clearly see that even if you just look up Wikipedia, it says that one of the common ways of explaining the Tetragrammaton is not explaining it, but looking for the specific word here, a replacement for the Tetragrammaton is saying the Holy One. So that's how modern versions read. They read, you are righteous, and then it will say, who is and was the Holy One. It's quite amazing. And even just a bog standard Wikipedia article says that. So anyway, let's move on.
Okay, 16.
That was one, and also the ending of Revelation 22.
So the ending of Revelation 22. So basically what happened was there was a couple of words. So this is Erasmus's original story. There was a couple of words at the end that had been damaged in our manuscript. So what I did is I looked at the Latin and I amended those Greek words from the Latin, and I have told the Aldine guys, so the guys who he used to work with Aldus Manutius, so the guys who worked for Aldus, I've told them to with their manuscripts of the Book of Revelation to amend the reading accordingly, because he knew that they had a bunch of manuscripts. And so he said there are only a few words. Okay, so fast forward at like 200 years, actually probably 300 years, and you get a guy called Franz Delitzsch, sorry. So he was doing a Hebrew Bible. I think he actually did it for the Trinitarian Bible Society. They still use Franz Delitzsch's Hebrew. I'm pretty sure that's the work that Albert Hemd was working on. But anyway, so Delitzsch, he had found a manuscript somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where he found it, and Erasmus had said that he borrowed his manuscript from Reuchlin. Okay. So Delitzsch, 300 years later, he's found this manuscript with the name Reuchlin on it, and it's the Book of Revelation. And he's like, he looks at the end, and there's the last page is missing of the Book of Revelation. And so it's a Greek commentary. So it's got the Greek commentary there, and it's got the Greek text. And so they had to extrapolate the Greek text out of there to make the biblical text. Okay. But so this is a commentary. It's owned by Reuchlin. So he's gone, this is the one Erasmus used, because Erasmus said that he used Reuchlin's text. But not really understanding who Reuchlin was. Reuchlin was a manuscript collector. So it's a bit like saying, well, CSNTM, they had this manuscript, and it's like, I'm sure that they've got many manuscripts. I'm sure that the Vatican Library has a lot of manuscripts that sort of are duplicates. I'm sure that Reuchlin, he could have owned 2 of these, 5 of these, 20 of these. And when you look at Andreas's commentary in the Book of Revelation, there's like 200 of these. So I'm sure that Reuchlin could have owned a few of them. So who's to say that this is the exact same one? So there's 6 verses missing. So that became the official. Erasmus lied in his annotations, and he actually back translated from Latin 6 in complete verses. And so you hear James White say this. Many people say this. So Franz Delitzsch, he came out and said this. So Tregegels, who had a bit of he was a popular guy among the evangelicals, he came out and supported this notion, and he translated Delitzsch's work from German into English. It became quite popular, and so this became the official story. And so this was one of the main stories that people were like, oh, we can't trust the Textus Receptus anymore. Well, we've got this new manuscript that this is the one that Erasmus used. And look, he lied to us. He said he only just spotted homoioteuton in Revelation chapter 22, verse 19, with the issue of the book of life and things like that. And he amended it. But clearly, when you look at the manuscript that we've just found, it's missing the last page, which is 6 entire verses. So he must have lied. Instead of just questioning whether it is the actual manuscript, he must have lied. And also, he back translated I think it's 136 words, where Erasmus said it was only a few. And when you actually go through, like I've done, and you examine the 1516 text where he mentions this, in the 1519 text, his next edition, he doesn't have that footnote anymore because it got fixed. And when you look at it, there's no change whatsoever. So he actually back translated from the Latin in those few little bits perfectly. And it's like they have this story. It's just another one of these Erasmus, is like Joe Biden walking around, banging his head, slipping on a banana peel, running around the scriptorium. They have all these anecdotes. He rushed to print. He was trying to beat the Complutensian polyglot guys. Where really the Complutensian polyglot guys, they had, if you know anything about the Complutensian polyglot, if you've actually looked at the manuscript, you can tell they've done the New Testament, but it has a full Old Testament dictionary in that as well. So when they print the Old Testament, they have to have the New Testament, they have to bring it out at the same time. They can't just bring out the New Testament with this Hebrew dictionary in it. It doesn't make any sense. And so this whole rush to print thing, it's ridiculous. And yes, it did get to the stage where it was, I think it was 1517, 1518, but in no way does that prove that they were just rushing to print to try and beat the Complutensian guys. Then it's the rash wager where he said, if anyone can find the Comma Johanneum, I'll put it in there, and then reluctantly someone made a manuscript and said, here you go. And he's like, oh, no, I have to put it in there. Just these stupid, that basically, if you understand that the critical text people have been trained to their back teeth to get the Three Stooges and apply that to Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza. And if you understand that, every time they talk about the history of Stephanus or Beza or Erasmus did this, just check it. Just double check it, go through, look at, and think about it logically. Would he do this? And half the time, if you just question it, you just sit there for a while and go, that's ridiculous. That's a stupid story. And just question what they're saying. Because what I've found is with me writing the book on Revelation 16:5, and then with Jeff Riddle and Larry Brigden from the Trinitarian Bible Society and a few other guys, retranslating the Annotationis of Theodore Beza at Revelation 16:5, he clearly said he had a manuscript. So before that, we were sort of like, well, I used to think that back in 2013, I think it was, but then I sort of moved back away from it. But then when it was retranslated, I was like, absolutely, he's saying he has a manuscript. This is great. And so we've brought that to their attention, say to Jan Kranz. Jan Kranz is like, oh, yeah, well, we can't get around it. Yes, he does admit that. Yes, it's been retranslated. Very good job, boys. But Beza tricked himself. He thought he had a manuscript, but he didn't. And you're just sort of there going, huh? How do you know that? How do you get to that conclusion? But there's just silence. It's just, he's a scholar. He's just made up a story. And then you hear people repeating this. And you're just like, man. it doesn't seem to matter what evidence you show these people. They're just going to make up a little bit of a funny story. Bees is just, he's an older guy. He walked around, hit his head, did the Joe Biden walking up the stairs to get the plane thing and just slipped over and banged his head and thought he had a manuscript, but he didn't. You can't make this stuff up. Well, they are making this stuff up. You can make this stuff up. Anyway.
Because his manuscript was lacking those verses, and he...
Notice the manuscript was lacking those verses. That's not what Erasmus said. So either Erasmus is a liar, and all it would take is for one person to point that out about Erasmus. Anyone working in the print shop at that time could go, hey, no, Erasmus, you said a few words there. Now, there was more than a few. There's 136 words involved. All it would take, and his whole reputation would be just down the drain. All it would take is for Reuchlin, who he borrowed the manuscript from, to say, actually, Erasmus, you're saying that you're only having a few words here, and it's basically an issue of parablepsis in Revelation 22:19, but clearly there's 6 verses involved here. It would have Reuchlin was equivalent scholar in Hebrew, and so Erasmus knew him very well. He was learning Hebrew from him. So oftentimes you'll see in his annotationis, you'll see him quoting Hebrew, and a lot of that is through his association with Reuchlin. And so all Reuchlin would have to do is say, no, Erasmus, you've lied. But no one said this until Delitzsch, years, 300 years later. We found a manuscript, and it doesn't match up. It's like, well, it's probably not the same manuscript then. No, we have a story that goes along with it. Okay, another Erasmus story. Okay, let's hear it. Blah, 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 Erasmus lied, blah, 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 Anyway.
Either by himself or with the help of Lorenzo Valla's translation in Latin. He went back, translated from Latin to recreate that, and he was pretty good. He created some words that have never appeared in any Greek manuscript of Revelation.
So he said he created some words that have never appeared in any Greek text of Revelation, but these have been examined and thoroughly answered. And so even Maurice Robinson is just unaware of the scholarship that Textus Receptus people have done on this.
In doing so, but it didn't lose the sense. So in terms of the sense, it wasn't so bad. But it's still, the TR was not either a majority text or a Byzantine text. In fact, in Revelation, it's very hard to...
It's so strange. The TR is not a majority text or a Byzantine text. Yes, a majority text according to how he defines a majority text, but it is a Byzantine text because every reading that Erasmus used was from Byzantine manuscripts. And so which manuscripts did he have and did he utilize that weren't Byzantine?
Speak of a majority text because the Byzantine splits into 2 different lines of transmission, which are called the Andreas and the Q line. And where
so the Andreas is the Revelation commentary that Erasmus extrapolated his text from.
They agree, there's the Byzantine text. Where they disagree, a decision has to be made one way or the other.
Okay, so you have to make decisions on this. So Erasmus made decisions on this. Who would you trust to make good decisions on this? World-leading scholar in Greek and Latin, or someone who couldn't even order a gyros in Thessaloniki at 2:00 in the morning and ring up a taxi? These guys can't speak Greek.
In the rest of the New Testament, you don't have that problem, except in the woman in adultery passage where it splits into 3 major lines of text. That's my specialty. Of course, I also did my dissertation on Revelation too, so I'm very familiar with what's going on with both of those.
And unfortunately, it's outdated information on the book of Revelation.
But in the rest of the New Testament, aside from those, most of the TR is very close, but still, close but no cigar.
So now he's saying it's very close. And so obviously there are going to be overlaps if we believe that, like, if someone has an Aramaic primacy position, or they're following this Syriac Peshitta or something like that, and I've got a good argument for why this reading should be there, and they come along and they've got the same reading, and they adopt my argumentation, I don't mind that. That's fine. At least they're moving closer to my position, sort of thing. But Maurice Robinson, like, they're sort of saying we can't use his arguments. Well, why not? I mean, we could just basically gut your argument and make them our own, but we're giving credit where credit's due, because you've done the hard work on this, on the Pericope Adulterae and things like that.
To the majority or the Byzantine text. And as some have said, you could call the TR a sort of subtext of the Byzantine or majority text. Now, if you want to get to just the distinction between Byzantine and majority, the majority is what the name means. It's
Right.
The numerical majority. And this is what Gordon Fee seriously criticized, because it basically comes down to counting noses. And does that mean 50% plus one manuscript, and that's supposed to be the best, or something like that? And the Byzantine tradition doesn't even look at the numbers on that. In fact, when we created our Byzantine text, Pierpont and myself, our main concern was to eliminate the larger number of Byzantine manuscripts that have no real bearing on the text. So we eliminated manuscripts from the 12th century onward, and yet the bulk of Byzantine manuscripts that were copied were from the 12th through the 14th centuries.
So they've eliminated from the 12th century onwards. I mean, even Peter Gurry's said things like a 14th century Byzantine manuscript can have the correct reading over and above everything that went before it. And so I think they've just gotten this idea in their head that the oldest is best and all that sort of stuff. And they're saying they're looking at everything, but they're obviously making some very harsh textual choices and saying, well, let's not look at anything after the 12th century. It's like, well, that's very limiting on a text. Anyway, it's what they're doing. I don't agree with it. I think they're still trying to find the Bible. I mean, when you look at the majority text, who do you know is reading the majority text right now in their church? Which pastors have a majority text and they're reading a translation of it? Hardly anyone. Like, you would, a few dorks here and there. It's when I say dorks, I mean nerdy type people might have a web translation or something like that. But it's like, it has not been translated, it has not been used, it has not been utilized. So the promises of God to have his word spread out and go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation, translating the Bible into all languages, all this sort of stuff, it just hasn't happened with that text, has it? But it's happened with the Textus Receptus. So which one would you think has fulfilled the prophecies about the word of God being available, being able to, people will know the words of God, that Jesus says the words that he says will be judged according to what he said. So how can we know when we're committing the sin of adding and subtracting from the Bible in Revelation chapter 22, verses 18 and 19, if we don't know where the words of God are? How can we ever commit that sin? If you don't know that, fornication's wrong or homosexuality's wrong, or you don't know that, you have no idea, and you just like, oh, I'm pretty sure you can just do it. And well, the thing is, these guys don't have a definitive text, so they can add and subtract. They can go home right from this meeting and delete 20 words from the Book of Revelation, and they're like, well, that's fine. That's what I want to do, and put it in the next edition. Where I can't do that because I know where the words of God are. These guys don't. And so inadvertently, that verse is basically saying there will be one text, because it's saying you add and subtract from those words. Your part is taken from the Book of Life. It's a very big sin. And so don't do that. Don't add and subtract. These guys can add and subtract whenever they want, because they don't know where the words of God. They've just got a confidence in the word. They're not absolute as they label us. You know, we're absolutely 100% sure where the words of God are. They say that that's a sin. We're actually there in sin by adding and subtracting.
But we didn't need them. We had a sufficient Byzantine text in the Byzantine manuscripts that exist from the 4th century all the way through the 11th. So that was sufficient to establish the text. And if we had the others, it just becomes window dressing, because they're not going to contribute anything new or dramatic that would change anything.
That's super helpful. Yeah, I've got my friend Timber here, who is an expert in these matters, an expert on the history of the King James, and has far more than dabbled in text critical matters. I wonder what questions you have for Dr. Robin.
So many. So I have often characterized the text of Erasmus, and I would distinguish just that first early edition and the many later editions that come along. So we sometimes think of the manuscript basis of the TR and I think underestimate it. But I'd love to hear your opinion on this characterization. I have often characterized Erasmus's text, and therefore to a derivative degree the later editions of the TR, as largely Byzantine, together with a collection of some Western readings and some Erasmian innovation, whether that be adding in Acts 9:5-6 or Acts 8:37, and then all those little mistakes that come, as you mentioned, not just in the last section of.
So the thing is, because they don't have in their hand a bunch of manuscripts that have these readings in the Greek, where Erasmus most probably did, because he wasn't just adding the Common Johanneum in without, he was telling everyone, if I had that reading in Greek, I would have put it in. And so he obviously had those readings in Greek in his manuscripts that he had. Just because you don't have them today. See, the strange thing is their whole story about Revelation chapter 22 and the last 6 verses, which I think is ridiculous. But that manuscript apparently went missing for 300 years, and Delitzsch found it. And it's like, oh, look, we got this manuscript. So they can believe that one of Erasmus's manuscripts went missing for 300 years. So if I turn around and say, well, I think that the manuscripts that he was using are missing, they're gone, they're probably burnt, they're probably, in a cave somewhere that might never be found. And these guys are like, oh, that's ridiculous. You're arguing from silence and all this sort of stuff. It's like, no, this is the general consensus of scholars when they're talking about this type of thing. So, which manuscript did Beza have with Revelation 16:5? You don't know. I don't know. Who knows? So anything anyone's saying at the moment is speculation. And so if it wasn't for me writing the book on Revelation 16:5, that no one would ever really even question that. And so when you look at Erasmus, the more people focus on it, then things come to light, and people quote things that were by people surrounding Erasmus, and it's like, oh, he used this or he used that. But at the moment, things that are very solid and very clear about what Erasmus did are just completely turned upside down, and he's just slandered and lied about. And so you can't expect that these people would just come out and say, yeah, well, perhaps he had, manuscripts that read that way that are just no longer in existence. They're gone. And as Dan Wallace said, World War II alone, 1 million biblical manuscripts gone. How come Delitzsch can find an Erasmian manuscript, apparently, and it's just accepted, oh, that's it, and how can it go missing for that long? Manuscripts like eventually will be found? It's just sort of like a Disney ending sort of thing. It's like, no, some manuscripts will be burnt, some of them will be destroyed, some of them will be covered in mold, some of them will, they're probably sitting there in a church basement right now, just covered in mold, and if they don't find it in the next 2-3 years, there's nothing left. Unfortunately, that's reality. And so these guys think they know everything about Erasmus and everything that he had and every reading that he had, and they're not looking either at Manetti 70 years before. He did his Latin translation based on Greek manuscripts. So his Latin translation is basically a representation of Greek. It's basically a Bible based upon the Greek, just like what Jerome said his was. And look at Lorenzo Valla's work as well. Many of these people from that era, very focused on the Greek. So, but they want to hold it in their hand. They want to have a picture of it on CSNTM, because their idea of biblical preservation is manuscripts and doctrine instead of words. But Jesus said he would preserve his words.
Of Erasmus's revelation, I think throughout the book we can count 60, and I think one scholar's counted 80 places where Erasmus incorporates a Latin reading and translates from Latin into Greek.
So Tim Berg, like, oh, well, Erasmus just did this and just did that. Or why didn't he do that with the Comia Henium? So this is the thing. I'm just pointing out a glaring inconsistency where he got in a lot of trouble for not including the Comia Henium. He could have just said, well, it's in the Latin. I'm incorporating 60 to whatever he said, 80 readings from the Latin anyway. I may as well just put the Comia Henium in. It's in 95% of the Latin. But he didn't do that, did he? So your story, their story would match up with extant manuscripts that they hold in their hand today. And so half the time, even just looking at something like 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, with Codex Alexandrinus and many other manuscripts, they say, oh, no, it didn't have theos there, it had os, who. Instead of God was manifest in the flesh, it's who appeared in the body, the strange, bizarre reading, the solecism. And many times these are cited in the NA series. I know specifically in the NA 27, there were 6 false citations. So if you look at ultraviolet lighting that they've worked on, that can show what the original hand had. Under those conditions, you can see that there's 6 false citations in the NA 27 about 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, saying os instead of God, theos, and being in the nomina sacra form. And so it's like they're not even using modern technology to come up to speed with their apparatus. So why would I trust that what Timothy Berg's saying about the Latin and he incorporated all these Latin readings in there? Why would he do that? When the only place he said he did that was right at the end of the book of Revelation, a few words, and he said it will get amended by the Aldine guys, and then he never mentioned it before. He never mentioned it again in his 4 later editions. So it's just inconsistent, and I just wouldn't trust that the data that Timothy Berg has is trustworthy.
So I'm just curious how you would feel about that characterization. Do you like it? Is it right? Is it wrong? Tell me all the things I've been mistaken.
Well, it's not that mistaken. I mean, you can have a book by Jan Kranz, which is on Erasmus. And
so we often talk about Jan Kranz in his book. And so he makes up some anecdotes about Erasmus himself, like with the translation of the Latin word olim in his book. What he does, instead of Erasmus in his Annotationis saying, well, the Greeks once doubted who wrote the book of Revelation, what Jan Kranz does is he changes the meaning of the word olim, and it basically translates to Erasmus doubts who wrote the book of Revelation, instead of it was formally doubted. So that's what the word olim means. In times past, it was, they doubted who wrote the book of Revelation. So the Greeks, they did that. And so, but Erasmus, he clearly said, John wrote the book of Revelation. And it's clear in the book of Revelation itself. It says, I, John, was on the island Patmos, etc. And so, but he tries to make out that, Erasmus was sort of like this liberal scholar who was like, it's probably just some guy who wrote it. It's not important. This is Jan Kranz's opinion. But, I've pointed out heaps of mistakes in Jan Kranz, especially when it comes to Revelation 16:5, and he basically says that Theodore Beza, he says he had a manuscript, but he tricked himself. It's like, how are you getting that? So he made up another anecdote. So that's just two anecdotes that I know of, just from my interactions with Jan Kranz and just talking about these things. So he just makes up stories. It's just like Bart Ehrman just makes up a story, and it sounds great. And if people believe it, well, that's fine. If you can completely prove it wrong and prove that their scholarship's wrong, no one would ever say they're a bad scholar. They're just, he's okay. He's one of us. Where if I did that, if I made up a story and, this scribe said this and said that, but he sort of tricked himself, people would be like, man, this guy's the biggest loser. He's wrong. He shouldn't be a scholar, sort of thing. But so he's pointing to Jan Kranz, of all people, who's sort of like Bart Ehrman light. But he's in the academy, and he still ticks the boxes to be in a church sort of thing. But it's like, just read his material. You'll sort of come to the similar conclusions that he's very liberal.
Beza as conjectural critics, where he discusses many of these things where sometimes readings were made up out of whole cloth.
Sometimes readings were just made up of thin air. No, they weren't. And I will defend those readings. And so the big one was Revelation 16:5. And I think I've absolutely destroyed the narrative that's been going around for 150 years on that. Because none of these guys know that it's part of the Tetragrammaton. they have no idea about it. And so even to the point where for someone to even argue against me, I have to teach them about the Tetragrammaton, about the name of Jehovah, about the etymology of Jehovah. It's not Yahweh and all this. I have to go through it all and teach them. And then they're like, yeah, I don't agree because I'm a critical text guy. And it's like, okay. But it's these guys have no idea about. I'll debate anyone in the world on this. Absolutely, I will make mincemeat of them because there's really no argument against it. If you understand the Hebrew, you understand that the etymology of Jehovah is the one which is and was and shall be. It's the name of Jehovah. So, what can they say about that?
Because, like in Revelation 16:5, Beza decided he needed to have it match with what was earlier in a similar phrase. So he said, well, all the manuscripts must be wrong. So they're...
Notice that's where his scholarship's at. So he doesn't really know much about it. So I would just say right now, Maurice Robinson knows almost zero about the issue of Revelation 16:5. He's probably read James White's book, and I proved that James White doesn't really know much about it, and pretty much everything that he said that he sort of knew a little bit about was usually wrong. It was twisted and turned around, and at the end of the day, every manuscript is a representation of Beza's reading because it's a nomina sacra. And of all people, Maurice Robinson should be able to see that. So I would just say publicly here, Maurice Robinson is completely 100% wrong about what he's saying here. He did not do this because Theodore Beza did not change that reading because of harmonization, or else it would have Ho'on kaho en kaho echomenos. Instead, it's got Ho'on kaho en kaho esomenos. Why did he change it to esomenos then? What? That's not harmonization. Or else he'd harmonize it. That's what Erasmus said. He said it could be echomenos in his Annotationis. And so, but it's clearly esomenos. And Beza said he had a manuscript. So Maurice Robinson doesn't know this, but he's willing to get on a show and say Revelation 16:5 blah 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 as one of the main reasons for rejecting the Textus Receptus, just like Nessel did in his writings against the Textus Receptus. He was trying to get people to gravitate towards his text. And so he was saying, how stupid are people still going with the Textus Receptus reading at Revelation 16:5, blah, blah, blah. That's in like 1898. And still, you got 125 years almost later, still ignorance about this text. And I'll debate. I know Maurice Robinson's probably not, he mightn't want to debate or anything, but if he does, I'll debate him on Revelation 16:5 any day. I'll debate anyone on that. Organize it for me. I won't debate on Donny's channel. And I just want to let you know, I jumped on to, I think it was Praise I Am's channel, and I was just chatting away there. And then Donny jumped on there. He's like, just mocking and everything. But the day before, I'd been listening to him talk about 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27, I think, where they were saying being a castaway, because it's the same Greek word as reprobate. Paul was saying, lest I be a reprobate or a castaway. And he was saying, no, that's not, becoming a reprobate. That's, you've lost your ability to talk to people because, if you are nasty to the Jehovah's Witnesses, you've lost their audience. You'll never be able to preach to those people. And so you should always be kind and nice and everything. And so the next day he's just mocking me and just saying really vile things about me, lying about me. And so I asked him a few questions, and then he just muted me. It was like, it's just amazing. So I don't know why he has such a hatred towards me. I guess because he probably fears that, I'll start doing some expose programs on him being basically an Andersonite and following Stephen Anderson. It's interesting, Stephen Anderson's son just a month ago did an interview where he said Stephen Anderson was abusing him and the other children in the family. It's quite an interesting interview to go through, and I guess people really need to be careful about associating themselves with Anderson, just adopting whatever he says eschatology wise. And his pretty much what I realized was everything Donny has said in his book is pretty much Anderson, like 99% of his Anderson. There's a tiny bit of Kirshner there. Even the maps and everything all match. Anyway, that's a full side issue. Let's move on.
Therefore, I'm going to change the text as I print it. And Erasmus did this type of thing several times. If they had just followed only their manuscripts, their TRs would have been a better text.
They did follow the manuscripts, but they recognized that there were good texts and there were poorer texts. And they recognized that it's not just the majority of readings. Just because some scriptorians, had more printed, I mean, you've got to understand that Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Ottomans, and Mehmed he blew that place to bits and then lived there. And the Hagia Sophia is still there as a reminder to that era. But the Greeks fled from there. And so what did they leave behind? What was destroyed? What was burnt? What was, and so were there more pure lines of text that, because there was about 5,000 Greeks living in Venice when Erasmus was there, and he was part of that whole Byzantine school. He was one of the main guys there. And so, what did he have access to there? What did Aldus Manutius have access to there? Because he did the first entire Greek Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament, all in Greek. That's Aldus Manutius. So these are legendary Greek scholars, So anyway,
but even so, like you mentioned, something like Acts 8:37. Acts 8:37 has around 60 manuscripts supporting, which sounds great, except when you say, well, at that point in Acts, there's about 600 to 700 manuscripts, and then you realize, oh, this is a minority text. And if you look at the compilation that is made from Text und Textwerk from Münster, you will find that the division among the manuscripts, those 60 manuscripts, they divide in multiple ways, and out of the whole bunch, nearly all of them don't agree with the TR form of that verse. And I think there's only one line of the thing that agrees with the TR form, and it's from very late manuscripts that may have themselves been copied from a TR. So this is the thing. Some people want that to be in.
So they're talking about extant manuscripts again, instead of going back and going, well, what Erasmus had, he had Greek manuscripts and he was utilizing them, and they're probably just lost in time. What did Manetti have? What was there's so many, like 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts that come from the Greek manuscripts that were utilized. And so what about those? What about representations of Greek being translated into Latin? What about representations of early church writers talking about these things? So that they're only just looking at one thing, where the Textus Receptus looks at the three in the closed class of witnesses: the Greek, the Latin, and the early church writings.
Because they think it's a great idea, and it does reflect 2nd century baptismal practice that you make a confession before baptism. But if you think of it in context without 837 in there, you've got the Ethiopian eunuchs saying, basically, what prevents me to be baptized? Why would he even ask that question unless he's already been evangelized and has believed?
And has been told that baptism is something that you're supposed to do now.
Yeah, it has to be. So why would he ask the question and then be told, well, if you believe with all your heart, you may, and then he gives a confession? That does not make any sense, except in terms of what they did in the 2nd century and later baptismal practices.
Yeah.
So he's got his own presupposition there, where it's a bit like with James White, saying that the last 12 verses of Mark are Gnostic readings. The Gnostics had those type of readings there, but then later on, James White turned around and someone said, well, so if they found like a Vaticanus find or a Sinaiticus type of find that had the last 12 verses of Mark there, and everyone was like, well, they should be in the text, would you accept it? And he's like, yes. And so he would accept a Gnostic reading in the text. It's so strange. And then Peter Gurry says the last 12 verses of Mark are apocryphal. Okay. So I guess, these guys are saying in the Textus Receptus, it's just sort of made up. It's just been put in there by author. This is the Orthodox scribes. They came along and just put their doctrines into the text. And so, J. Green Sr.'s view that the majority text is a corrective of such readings, as Acts 9, 5, and 6, 1 John 5, 7, etc. Like the New King James's view that the majority text corrects such readings, shows the Burgonite methodology is different than that of the received text methodology. The 16th and early 17th century scholars like Erasmus and Beza were known to have reconstructed these passages from Latin authorities and or a slim number of Greek authorities, not in the representative Byzantine text. There is nothing new or startling about this discovery by, for example, 20th century Neo-Alexandrian advocates of the Nestle-Alarm United Bible Society text, or Burgonite advocates such as Maurice Robinson of the majority text. Any fool who was asked about it in the 16th century could have been shown, for example, Stephanus's New Testament with 15 variants showing both Greek and Latin, and told the basic facts. The issue both then and now is not whether a relatively small number of verses in the New Testament were reconstructed from Latin, possibly with the slim number of late Greek manuscripts, but rather whether or not on the basis of textual analysis they are part of the original Greek autograph. To assume, as do modern textual critics, both of the Neo-Alexandrian Westcott and Hort type in the RV or ASV, Nestle or Nestle-Alarm United Bible Society type in the NASB, RSV, NRSV, ESV, or NIV, or the Burgonite majority text type in the New King James Version, that the mere fact that they are not found in most or any ancient Greek manuscripts, they are therefore not authentic, says more about the low level of textual analytical skills of these Neo-Alexandrians and Burgonites than it does about the merits of the matter. Textual scholars like Erasmus, Beza, and the AV translators considered the Byzantine text a starting point and agreed with more than 90% of it, but they were not prepared to regard the Byzantine text they had, or had it been available to them, a modern equivalent such as the Byzantine majority text, as the finishing point. Rather, they would carefully weigh any variance with the Byzantine text together with any variants found in the Latin textual tradition, as well as ancient or less commonly medieval church Latin and Greek writers, and made a decision on stylistic analysis of the Greek text, if necessary, as reconstructed from the Latin. Thus, on the one hand, their starting point was the representative Byzantine text, and they were only prepared to move away from it with the greatest reluctance. But on the other hand, the final analysis, they were not prepared to abdicate their final decision to a number count of representative Byzantine texts. Just, oh well, we've got 50 of these. Oh, well, we've got 40 of these. Oh, we're going to go with the 50, That is, they were textual scholars of a very fine order indeed. I consider men like, for example, Erasmus of Rotterdam, Stephanus of Geneva, Beza of Geneva, to be in a class of textual criticism well above anything that men like the Neo-Alexandrian Westcott, Hort, Aylin, Metzger, or the Burgonite majority text, even Dean John William Burgon, J. Green, Robinson, Pierpont, Hodges, Farstead, could ever hope to realistically attain to. These guys can't fluently read Latin. They can't fluently read Greek. They haven't examined the amount of manuscripts that people like Beza, Stephanus, Erasmus did. There's been so much more work done in that period of time. These guys are just tinkering around, just throwing words here and there, throwing theories here and there, and trying to attain to a text that sticks. And so what we see is, like, say, for example, Luke 2:22, I mentioned that. Very slim Greek evidence, but at the end of the day, just knowing how that is in Leviticus chapter 12, with her purification mentioned so many times in that chapter, it would be as ridiculous as saying that Jesus and Mary both got circumcised. You would go, hang on, it's a guy thing. Boys get circumcised, not girls. And so that's how silly the reading is. If you actually have, their purification, because it's clearly her purification. It's part of the law. You can't just change that. And so, and a textual scholar of the caliber of Beza, Stephanus, Erasmus, King James translators, they recognize this. They understand this. The internal evidence screams out. Where these guys would just go, no, where is it? Where's the majority of manuscripts that say this and say that? So a glaring error. So what you got to understand too, the Byzantines also have a textual transmission of the Septuagint. How's that going for them? So many errors, mistakes. Look at Jeremiah. Look at Methuselah living for 14 years after the flood and all this sort of stuff. Was their textual transmission pure? Was it absolute? Was it definitive? No, it had a lot of errors in it. So why would we suppose that we just have to go with absolutely every reading of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Church? No, we would go just as the Latin, just as Erasmus goes, yeah, actually the Latin's been copied. It was good in a lot of ways, but it's sloppy copying and errors have crept in and it needs an update. So what if you go to do that with the Greek? No, we have to go only with the majority. You can't ever correct it. It's weird. It's strange. But good scholarship can do that. I don't think these guys really have the bullets to be able to do that.
Which is a solid internal argument that you've made, not just on the basis of the manuscripts. And I agree with you.
In King James Onlyism, Dr. Robinson, I constantly hear, if not the word, majority, the concept. So they'll say, we should stick with what 99% of the manuscripts say. When you hear that argument, how do you respond to a King James Onlyist?
I'd say, well, are you willing to go with 99% of the manuscripts every time? And the answer is, of course not.
That's ridiculous. Even he would admit that in the book of Revelation, it's a different book. It's a unique book. It has a unique transmission. There are unique readings in it. There's unique themes in it. So you can't just take that like the Gospel of John, where there's a whole, there might be 3,000 manuscripts that all agree with certain readings. You've got, in the book of Revelation, you've got like 300 manuscripts, and there can be lots of disagreements there. So you can't just go around with your hammer, just go, everything's a nail, Well, why don't they just go with the majority text all the time? It's silly. A scholar shouldn't be doing that. A scholar, yes, you look at the majority. The majority does come into play, but there are times when the reading is silly. There are times when you print a book and you do a print run and you've got 1,000 books out there and it has a typo in it. And you go, whoops, we better correct that. Oh, no, there's already 1,000 of them. That's the original reading. No, it's not. And especially when, the Greeks weren't that good at copying the Old Testament, were they, in the Septuagint? Why should we just accept everything? But why can't we look at that and look at what the early church writers said and look at the Latin evidence and look even outside of the closed class of witnesses?
Because just like the Acts 8:37, where they want to go with a smaller minority of the manuscripts, they have to have 1 John 5:7, the Johannine comma in there, and we know what that is like. There are approximately 509 manuscripts of that passage, and there's only 9 that have it.
All right. Oh. computer freeze. Okay, so my computer's frozen. And my screens are going black, which isn't a good sign. I haven't got that many things. So what I'll do, Control-Alt-Delete always.
And they're all late except for one that actually the earliest one is of the...
So maybe you could have still heard me during that. So basically my main screen went black, my other screen went black. So I was still chatting. Hopefully you can still hear me. So he's talking about the Commuhenium. Okay. So I'll just rewind it a little bit. I'm not sure why that is not. Oh, another black screen. Very strange. Haven't had this happen before. Must be the Illuminati now. So we're at about the 12-minute mark. So he's talking about the Commuhenium. So I'll just keep talking. Maybe what I'll do, I'll just shut that down.
Have it, and they're all late except for one.
Okay. I think just because it was on large screen, I might just shut down a few things. Sometimes Adobe can be in the background uploading and downloading and behaving crazy.
That actually the earliest one is minority of the manuscripts. They have to have 1 John 5:7, the Johannine comma in there, and we know what that is like. There are approximately 509 manuscripts.
So notice he's just going to go with the manuscript count there
Of that passage, and there's only 9 that have it, and they're all late except for one that actually the earliest one is of the 14th century, and otherwise it's found in Latin sources, and that's where it has found its way into the Greek, and the one from the 14th century happened to be a Latin Greek manuscript where the Latin influenced the Greek.
So it's quite amazing. If you go through that document, you can find other places where the Greek and Latin don't agree in that same manuscript. But see, what he doesn't mention is that because he doesn't know Greek, he really has no idea about the grammatical issue that occurs if you don't have 1 John 5:7 in the text. And so I contacted Georgios Babiniotis. Georgios Babiniotis, he would have to be the greatest Greek linguist alive. That's the conclusion I've come to. My appreciation of him has become more and more the more that I watch his programs and listen to what he has to say about the Greek. And he's written 6 dictionaries and he's printed 200 books on the Greek language. And so when he was here in Australia, he was talking about the influence of ancient Macedonian on the Greek language and all this sort of stuff. He's a brilliant guy. So 6 dictionaries he's written. So he knows the nuances, the syntax, the morphology of the Greek language probably better than anyone living. Okay. And so I asked him specifically if Eugenius Vulgaris was correct in 1780 when he had an article that claimed that the grammatical structure of 1 John 5:8 was modified for no reason if 1 John 5:7 is not there. So he had a very good case for this, and he was talking about the differences in the genders, the mismatch genders that occur if you omit 1 John 5:7. If you put 1 John 5:7 in there, There's no error. There's the Greeks call it a solecism. Okay, it's a grammatical blunder. Okay, so there's no blunder. If you have 1 John 5:7 there, it reads perfectly. If you don't have it in there, it's a huge error. And some critical text people admit this. Most don't, because they don't know Greek. And they're like, there's no error, there's no error. And then you talk to people who actually know Greek, and they're like, yeah, of course there's a solecism there, you know. So Georgios Babiniotis, he said that he agrees with Eugenius Vulgaris, and he said there was a syntactic parallelism that occurs there. And it's very clear that in English, if you were to read, say, Shakespeare, now every line that was in Shakespeare had to be 10 syllables. So it's quite helpful when you're looking at older words. Say, if you were to say a word, see, sometimes words used to have like 4 syllables, but now they've only got 3, or they used to have 3, but now they've got 4. And so it's quite helpful to know that in Shakespearean language that they had this I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's basically 10 syllables per line. So in Greek you have a type of structure where the grammar is changed according to what has previously gone before. And so you see this type of change in verse 8 that's completely unnecessary, where if you have verse 7 there, there is no problem. And this was pointed out by Erasmus. This is strong internal evidence from Erasmus. This was pointed out by, was it Gregory Nazianzus? I think his name was. And he actually said the Greek grammarians would, they don't agree with 1 John chapter 5, verse 8, because it goes against their grammatical rules. So he was pointing out the issue as well. And they're also not looking at the early church writings. So they're just going, manuscript evidence, that's it. Okay, so they're not looking at the 95% of Latin manuscripts. They're not looking at the internal evidence, grammatical issues that occur. They're not looking at the early church writings all the way from Cyprian through that quote this and have, these three are one, and it says, John says these three are one. Clearly quoting this. So that they just completely avoid all that, and they just go, Greek manuscript evidence, that's it. And so, and not even looking at any reason why that would be taken out. People who don't like the Trinity there, or Sabellianism, or whatever it could have been. They're not exploring those. Let's just count heads. See, the thing is, Timothy Berg and Mark Ward, they would never do their text criticism like this. When it comes to the last 12 verses of Mark, there's only 2 manuscripts that don't have 12 verses, and so they're not going with the majority there. The 1,637 manuscripts that do have it, they're just throwing all them out, and they're going with 2 manuscripts, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But then, Comma Johanneum, there's a few manuscripts that have it, but there's strong internal consistency. There's you have the witness of God is greater, and so why would it have this contrast between the witness of God and the witness of man, the testimony from man, if there's only been one witness? A witness of man, sort of thing. Internal evidence, then you have grammatical evidence, then you have the early church writers, and you just have magically, you have this solecism there in the Greek, which leading grammatical experts like Georgios Babiniotis, like Eugenius Vulgaris, like Erasmus, all the way through, they're saying there's an error there, but magically it's fixed by having the verse in there from the Latin. So imagine this story. Imagine what they have is original with this error in it. Then someone started off with a marginal note, and it got bigger and bigger. And eventually, they translated it from Latin into the Greek and put it in the text, and it magically fixed the grammatical errors there. Wouldn't it? It's pretty far-fetched. Wouldn't it make more sense that the one without the errors was the original, and it's been modified? As Jerome said, he said corrupt scribes were modifying that text, were omitting that text. He says that in Codex Fuldensis. And so there's so much more than just counting heads,
So again, are they willing to follow the 99% of the manuscripts at that point? And they come up with every convoluted reason not to.
Yeah, I've definitely felt the same thing. That
Every convoluted. Let's look up convoluted. Especially of an argument, story, or sentence, extremely complex and difficult to follow. Intricately folded, twisted, or coiled. So it's just this thing that's so hard to follow. Is it hard to follow when Greek grammarians are saying there's an error there, but with the Commuhanium there's no error? I mean, to me that seals the deal. That it really the only leg they have to stand on is numbers with the manuscripts. It's just a majority text thing, which these guys, when it comes to the last 12 verses a month, don't care about numbers. They throw all the majority text under the bus. But when it comes to attacking the TR, no, we really care about numbers. All of a sudden.
that actually, because that principle does not deliver to them Scrivener's Textus Receptus of 1881, suddenly you find that, up their sleeve was this majority principle where there's something even higher up their sleeve. There's another further principle, and they'll tend to reach for pretty much anything they can think of to justify.
Just anything we can think of. So, Mark Ward, I will debate you on this. I will debate anyone you send my way on this. And I personally spoke to Georgios Babiniotis. We talked about the Commuhanium. We talked about Eugenius Vulgaris. We talked about the solecism that is in the Greek text. And he read through Eugenius Vulgaris and said that he agrees with him. And so we also talked about Codex Sinaiticus and some of the readings there and a bunch of other things. So world-leading expert on the Greek language. He's written 6 dictionaries. Why don't you listen to him? Surely you know about this. I make videos sort of against you. I know sometimes you even use some of the words that I bring up. Bog standard wasn't really something that many people were talking about, except for myself. And then all of a sudden you're using the word bog standard. It's like I'm like, hang on, I think you stole that word from me. Perhaps he's only watched a few of my videos, but surely he would know about, maybe he doesn't know about Georgios Babiniotis. I would debate you, Mark. It's not just something that's up our sleeve. We're just getting further and further, just making up excuses. You've really got to represent us accurately. We believe that we have world-leading experts like Erasmus, like Eugenius Vulgaris, like Georgios Babiniotis. You mightn't even know who these people are. You should know who these people are. The argumentation that Eugenius Vulgaris used was utilized all the way through the period of attack against the Commuhanium by Ezra Abbott, by Ruckman, by Westcott and Hort. Many people pointed back to Eugenius Vulgaris. And then in modern times, I've talked to world-leading Greek expert, and he said he is in complete agreement with Eugenius Vulgaris, and the Commuhanium needs to be in there to have correct Greek grammar. So how do you get around that? it's not just something we've made up. How do you get around it's in 95% of the Latin manuscripts? Scrivener said out of 50 manuscripts, it was in 49. So, if they had 1,000 manuscripts, it would be in 990 manuscripts,
And I've even heard them say, well, that must have been the majority at some point, but, God, through his providence, guided the King James translators to choose what, and especially for Revelation 16:5, what must be right. So,
especially with Revelation 16:5, what must be right? Clearly it's a nomina sacra there, but I don't even think Mark Ward knows that, or else he wouldn't be saying what he's saying. But he is in the mode where he's saying, well, we're just making up stories. But he can't, he hasn't really got an argument against it. He's just mocking the Commuhanium concepts, Revelation 16:5 concepts. And so
the majority principle they are willing to throw out.
We follow the majority except where we don't want to.
Exactly.
No, they follow the majority as a basis, as a starting point, and move from there. Just like if we were to go with the Greek Old Testament, we might go, okay, let's get all the Greek Old Testament manuscripts, and we'll use the majority of readings as a starting point. You wouldn't just go, we just accept everything that comes down that pike, because that it doesn't match up with the Hebrew. And so you have other witnesses. You have the Latin, you have the early church writings. You can't ignore these. Why would you ignore these?
Exactly. Then it's not a principle.
Well, and that makes me curious if I can chime in to ask a question there, because that argument makes an assumption that they can reconstruct or assume what a majority used to.
Yeah, this becomes an argument.
Maybe some people are saying that, this was a majority reading back then, or this and that. There were people like Marcion going around polluting the text very early on. People at Origen, they were polluting the text as well. And so if they became popular, their text became popular and became a majority. It's like, well, but it doesn't mean that the original reading has faded out. And the original reading is what will be preserved. And so this is the thing. What did they have in the Reformation period? A TR. What have we got today? The TR. Who was using the critical text in the Reformation period? Zero. There's no one. Name one person. None. Who was using the majority text? Greeks. Greek Orthodox. What about their Septuagint? It's a mess. People use the majority text as a basis. The TR-AV defenders, they understand that Beza, Stephanus, Erasmus, they used it as the basis, because when you clearly see solecism, when you have 1 Timothy 3:16 with the greatest grammatical blunder in their whole Bible, with a predicate without a subject, so they have to make up the hymn theory that Paul broke into song in the middle of a sentence. It's ridiculous. It's clownish. It's lowbrow scholarship. But James White agrees with us on that. It just does my head in. Anyway.
But that's an argument from silence, though. They're saying, okay, we only have this small number now, but in the past there may have been hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts that read the way the TR did. But again, are you going to argue from evidence or your own conjecture?
Yeah. So what about the last 12 verses of Mark? See, most of the time when you're talking about these TR readings, they're talking about, a lot of the time it's just 2 or 3 letters in a word that modify it from being plural to singular to feminine, masculine, and so to think that maybe one word got transmitted wrongly, or sometimes it can be phonetic, monogenes weos or monogenes theos, very similar. What if in the scriptorium they're saying monogenes weos and it's like, oh, monogenes theos, someone wrote that and then that got transmitted, and the only begotten God or the only begotten Son. But what makes more sense? That's when you've got to look at these things.
And they have to argue from their own conjecture that way, because without it, they don't have a case to stand on to say that this must have been the majority reading, because there is no evidence for it. It's just a minority reading, and they're going to say we've got to defend it every way we can, so they come up with this convoluted reasoning.
Right. Well, so, and I don't mean to steal a bunch of your questions, but I'm curious. So I know you've written on, like, your blog for TCI, the influence of kind of a theology of Scripture and even a view of the preservation of Scripture on how we do textual criticism. I'm curious, if you were to take a theology of preservation like you hold, how would it wrestle with the question of what used to be there but had been lost? Now, would it be for you theologically possible for there to have been a majority reading in the text earlier that has now disappeared and is almost not found in the manuscripts?
See, the thing is, if they find a room in Mount Athos with 500 manuscripts in there that have all these, different readings, their text will change tomorrow. If Tim Berg and Mark Ward find another Vaticanus Sinaiticus type of find, they will adopt those readings into their text. If that's what happened around the era of Westcott and Hort, it modified the text. If they find something of that type of weight, again, that will modify their text. So the majority text guys, if they find 500 manuscripts in Mount Athos that turn some of these 30-70% manuscripts into, sorry, I'll just turn my phone off, into 50-50 or 60-40, or that would modify their text. And so the thing is, their text is ever changing according to what evidence is put in their hand. What happens if we have a World War III type of situation, and we get to the stage where they can shut down the power grid, your laptop becomes useless, your phone, everything, anything that's mechanical can just be destroyed or whatever. And all this work and putting manuscripts up online has been a waste of time. It's all that knowledge is gone now, and they're just trying to deal with what manuscripts they have. And then there's a war and half of those manuscripts get destroyed. What do you do then? What's the majority then? You know what I mean? And so their text can change at any time. At any unfavorable event or any favorable event, just finding a bunch of manuscripts or losing a bunch and not being able to find what those original readings were or whatever. And the thing is, our text has been stable for, the 1611, it's 400 years old. The Textus Receptus, the origins of that are 500 years old, right from the beginning of printing. So these guys are just sort of like new kids on the block, tinkering with the text, and these guys are in complete disagreement with their textual methodologies and their conclusions, but they're all united that they don't like the Textus Receptus and the King James.
Pierpont and I would not accept that kind of concept, because we don't argue from silence. It's that simple. We say, look, here is the evidence that God has allowed to be preserved.
So you notice the preservation is what's there today, extant manuscript. So if someone wrote like Jerome, they're omitting the Comma Johanneum out of the Bible, we've got to be careful about this. And then you see, yes, it's being omitted. To me, that's strong evidence as to why it's not in a lot of manuscripts. But these guys are like, no, you don't look at that, you just count heads, you know.
And it's the extant evidence. If God
Extant evidence you have in your hand today. So all the wars, 1 million biblical manuscripts, Dan Wallace said, we lost in World War II alone.
God had not wanted this extant evidence to be preserved, who knows what we would have had? Would we have had only one and one only manuscript? Would we have had thousands that were already totally identical? You can argue any way you want for what preservation could have been, but again, you can't tell God how he has to do it. The way he has done it is based on the evidence he has preserved to us.
And so what seems insane is that it's only still looking at evidence that's in Greek that we have today, and not really looking at, okay, well, what Greek evidence did Erasmus have, Stephanus, Beza, and what were their conclusions? That's just ignored. Well, they had access to things that these guys don't even know about. Like you know, we've proven Theodore Beza, Revelation 16:5, had an ancient manuscript with that reading. These guys, most of the time, don't even know about that, let alone what manuscript it was. And so they don't know as much as they're letting on. That they've just got their opinions, and at the end of the day, even extant manuscripts, even extant information, that they just ignore something like, oh, Theodore Beza said he had an ancient manuscript there. It's like people are just like, oh, where is it today? But, well, we don't have it. Well, that's not important then. Move on. It's like, oh, okay, so was Beza lying, or oh, he tricked himself? You know, it's like, just make something up. You know, just instead of going, hang on, you know, these guys were, you know, up to their necks in manuscripts, and you know, looking at things all the time and thinking about these things, and it's like, they've got something to say of worth, not just reject them and just count heads, you know.
And I have no problem.
It's a bit like, you know, after the Jewish Holocaust, it's like, let's count how many people are here. You know, that's only the families that are left. They're the only families that have ever existed. Everything else, it doesn't matter if it's written down. It doesn't matter if it's in a church record. It doesn't matter. They never existed. You know, it's like, no, you've got to look at all the evidence. That's what I keep saying. Every time I do a debate, I'm like, look at everything, because these guys limit themselves.
Problem saying that the Greek New Testament text was preserved, and I think that the true reading is there among our extant manuscripts. I don't accept the idea of conjectural emendation. I've had certain people that favor conjectural emendation, usually among the eclectics. They
notice the eclectics. So the critical text guys, they favor conjectural emendation. And so these guys have been taught that the King James has conjectural emendation. It doesn't.
Would differ from me on that, because, you know, even the Nestle 28 edition now has, I believe it's now up to 3 conjectures in the text. I would never accept any one of those.
Sure. Dr. Robinson.
And the amazing thing is, one of those conjectures that pretty much everyone rejects is from the CBGM. And so what confidence does that give you into thinking that the CBGM is going to give you correct readings? So I think they're about to change gears. So we're at the 16-minute mark here, and I think I can safely say that I can do the rest of this in one big video. It's just turned midnight here in Australia. So I think I'm going to bail. I'm going to split, but and we're just nearly at the 3-hour mark as well. So I think what I'll do is I'll shut this down. God bless you guys, and thanks for joining us. And if you have any questions or comments, just throw them into the YouTube comment section there, and we'll try and answer you the best that we can. And if you think that I've said something wrong, let me know. If you think that I've misrepresented anyone or have said something that's completely wrong, let me know. I mean, I do these programs and I'm saying some pretty full-on things about scholars and their conclusions and everything. But it's quite amazing how silent the critical text guys are with me. With someone like Sam Gipp, they're just like, oh, Sam Gipp said this, and Sam, it's like, but with me, they tend to be really quiet. I think because they know that I'm basically just saying things that can be validated. So anyway, we will look more at Maurice Robinson and his relationship to Dean John William Burgon, the majority text, and a whole bunch of other stuff. We'll look at that some other time, probably maybe Friday, American time, which will be Saturday, Aussie time. So God bless you guys. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.